before the Nile had carved its promise through the desert, and before the gods had names whispered on temple walls, there was only the slow breath of the earth and the quiet ache of survival. Beneath the overhang of a sandstone cliff, a woman opened her eyes to the shifting light of embers, the hush of ash curling skyward. The morning had not yet spoken, but she heard Itin echoes stirring beyond the stones. She reached out, touching the hardened ground with reverence, as if greeting an old companion. Her world was not measured by time, but by the warmth of fire and the chill of wind. She moved slowly, deliberately, her body draped in woven skins softened by hand and smoke. Around her, others slept, limbs tangled in exhaustion, hair matted with dust, mouths parted in dreams that had no words. A child stirred beside her, lips puckered around nothing, still tethered to the rhythms of the womb. She drew the child close and pressed a dry kiss to his brow, as if to anchor his spirit to the dawn. The fire needed tending. She knelt before it like a priestess, feeding it. A bundle of dried reeds tied with sinew. Sparks leaped, startled to life, dancing in the dim cave like souls unburdened. She coaxed it back to hunger, watching the shadows grow bold again on the cave wall. Her hands were calloused but graceful, moving with a quiet rhythm that had been passed from one woman to another long before memory took form. Outside, the air was colder than breath. The stone beneath her feet drank the chill like a sponge. She stepped out beneath the overhang, where stars still bled faintly above the mountains. The world was not yet awake, but the sky was peeling open with grey. She listened not for danger, but for balance. The night had ended, but only gently. She could still hear the moon, trailing behind the hills like a secret. She moved down the slope with a basket of woven reed strands hanging from her back, stitched tightly with effort and ash. Her bare feet knew the path without eyes. She passed thornbrush, boulders, clusters of lizards pressed to warm crevices. She knew where the wild onions grew, where the bees guarded their sweetness, and where no human scent should linger. She was not a wanderer. She was a collector of life. At the spring, she bent low and let her fingers touch the water first, as though to wake it. The ripples caught the slow bloom of dawn above her, shivering with color. She scooped it into a clay jar, careful not to disturb the silt. Her face, reflected in the water, looked older than her moons, not from years, but from knowing. Her eyes did not belong to one woman, they were the vessels of all those before her. On the way back, she paused to pull sprigs of bitter root from the base of a stone. She placed each carefully in her pouch, whispering a chant beneath her breath, something older than speech, but deeper than silence. Each plant had a story, for fevers, for labor pains, for children who would not sleep. She carried not just food, but answers, not just leaves, but language. Back at the cave, the others began to shift in their blankets of hide and hair. A cough, a murmured yawn, a flint striking flint in some dim corner. The sun had not yet poured into the hollow, but its breath was already there. She returned with her bounty, placing it at the center of their worlder, sunless altar of fig, thorn, and water. No one praised her aloud. She did not expect them to. Survival did not wear laurels. The child had awakened and reached for her breast. She lifted him wordlessly, letting his small mouth find what it sought. As he fed, she looked beyond the cave mouth again. Hawks drifted in the distance like floating eyes. A dust wind carried the faint scent of distant burnt trees, wild mint, animal dung. She knew what was near and what was not. Her vigilance was not fear, but stewardship. One of the younger women sat beside her, dragging a sharpened stone across a strip of hide. She said nothing. The cave was not a place of idle talk. It was a place of breath, labor, and waiting. But the two women shared something more than speech, the rhythm of task, the warmth of presence. Their silence was a thread, not a wall. Later, they prepared the fire pit outside, where stone circles held the memory of countless meals. She ground seeds into paste with the rounded belly of a stone. Another mashed wild garlic. A third watched a lizard roast slowly on a skewer of reed. The air filled with a scent both primal and precious. Food, no matter how humble, was a ceremony. Children ran around the outer stones, their limbs thin and fast, covered in dirt. She watched them like one who had been them, who still carried their fears in her blood. She called out to one with a flick of the wrist, a signal for caution. The child stopped, turned, nodded. These were lessons without language, carried like echoes through behavior. When the heat of midday rose, The women retreated inside, sitting near the walls where the oldest ochre marks remained. Faded red lines of animals long gone. Symbols no one had drawn in years. She traced them sometimes with her fingers, not to remember but to continue. She believed, somewhere deep in the husk of her being, that these stories would return again someday. Etched in something stronger than stone, in a quiet corner, she took out dried reeds and began weaving. Her fingers moved with memory, twining the fibers into a loop, then into a basket, then into purpose. It was work, yes, but also meditation. Each twist a prayer, each pattern a whisper. She did not know who had first taught her, and yet she had never not known how to do it. It had been carried inside her like marrow. Evening did not arrive suddenly, but crept into the corners like a lover. The shadows returned long before the sun was gone. They cooked again, roots softened in ash, dried berries ground into pulp, small fish curled and blackened over flame. The food was passed in circles, without order or demand. Hunger was a shared god, and its worship quiet. That night, an elder told a story not with words, but with hands and eyes and rhythm. She drew shapes in the air, thumped her chest softly, mimicked the sound of wings. The children leaned in. The fire glowed brighter, as if listening. The woman who had fetched water sat back and watched, feeling the warmth of the cave wrap around her like skin. Later, wrapped in hide beside the child, she let her eyes blur into sleep. But sleep did not come swiftly. She listened to the night, the clicking of beetles on stone, the sigh of wind through the cave's mouth, the slow exhale of fire turning to smoke. Her mind drifted to the spring, to the roots, to the wings above her. Her breath became deeper, steadier, no longer hers alone. In her dream, she saw a woman made of reeds and water, with hair like streaming clay. The woman reached for her, said nothing, then turned and walked into the hill. The dream did not frighten her. It made her weep gently in her sleep. Some dreams are not warnings, but invitations, and when morning came again, slow and was already rising, already feeling the weight of another echo forming in the stones. Her feet touched the ground again, and the world whispered, as it always had, begin. When the light outside the cave was no more than a whisper pressed between two breaths, she reached for the ash that ringed the fire. It had cooled in patches overnight, silver gray and silky as a ghost's shadow. She touched it softly, pinching some between her fingers, and rubbed it along her cheekbones, then down the bridge of her nose. There was no mirror, no polished copper, but she had learned how to feel her reflection, how to mark her presence without needing to see it. The ash was not merely for warmth or protection. It was a veil, a second skin. She wore it like a whisper of the night, blending herself with the color of stone and shadow. Insects stayed away from it, so did the scent of sweat. In a world where beasts tracked you by smell alone, this ritual was armor. The baby watched her, unblinking, his small eyes full of something ancient, like he had seen her do this before in some forgotten life, in some other cave that had long since turned to dust. She reached for the dried bundle of desert sage hanging near the fire pit. With careful hands, she snapped a stalk and lit its end in the remaining coals. It flared and smoked, hissing out a scent that clung to skin and thought alike. She waved it over her arms, under her chin, and into her hair. The smoke curled like snakes around her shoulders. Not perfume, not decoration, just a blend herself with the world that could eat her if she ever forgot her place. Outside the cave, the land was beginning to stir. The rocks held on to the last coolness of night, though the promise of heat already lingered on the breeze. She crouched just at the edge, watching the day emerge from beneath the horizon. She stayed low, partially hidden. The ash had dried now, clinging to her skin like a prayer. She felt not cleansed, but claimed. Like the smoke and dirt had accepted her into the order of things, into the hidden rules that ran beneath the louder world. Back inside, a mother was brushing tangles from her daughter's hair using a comb of sharpened thorns. The girl winced, but stayed still, her back stiff, eyes fixed on the fire. Pain was part of the ritual. Pain taught stillness. Another woman rubbed crushed flowers on her wrists, something sweet, something to invite the favor of unseen forces. These were not random motions. These were codes, handed from fingertip to fingertip. A way to say, I am here, without ever speaking aloud. The ash on her body had settled into the small lines of her skin, mapping the life she carried within. She looked down at her arms, the way the soot clung to scars and folds. These marks were not shame, they were proof. The day had not yet demanded anything from her, but still, she was preparing. To be ready was not caution, it was reverence. The world gave nothing, it only withheld a little less from those who asked politely, and with knowledge of the right offerings. Near the fire pit, someone cracked open a dried pod and began mixing its powdered core with warmed fat in a carved stone bowl. The smell was bitter, but necessary. This mixture, rubbed behind the knees and under the arms, kept the flies away. Her turn came, and she offered her arms. The woman smeared the mixture on her with steady fingers, as if sculpting her from clay. No words, just a nod, and the transaction was done. She belonged now more deeply to the day. The air inside the cave was thick with preparation. There were no conversations, no songs, only the quiet work of becoming ready to survive. Someone sharpened a bone pin against a flint, the scratch of stone on stone echoing like a whisper of warning. Another tested the strength of a leather tie. These were not luxuries, nor curiosities. They were the boundaries between death and dusk, between returning home and becoming a memory before noon. She watched as a woman rubbed ochre into her scalp, powdered red, like dried blood or sun-kissed clay. This was no ornament, it was medicine, a barrier against heat, a language for the gods, in case they were watching. The woman's eyes met hers across the dim space. There was no smile, no need. They understood each other like rocks, understand erosion slowly, constantly, without permission. When the time came to leave the cave again, she stood near the entrance and pressed her fingertips into a bowl of crushed charcoal mixed with river mud. She painted a line across her forehead, another across her chest. These markings were hers, not given by man, but by earth, by survival, by the need to be seen, by the things that cannot speak. She walked with her head low, not in shame, but in silence, the way one walks past sleeping beasts. She stepped again into the world. The sky had opened fully now, a dull gold, bleeding into soft blue. The air shimmered with new heat. Around her, other women moved, as she did quietly, without pause, without spectacle. They blended into the stone, into the plants, into the shapes of the land. If you were not watching, you'd think the desert moved on its own, that the hills had grown limbs and gathered berries and returned without footprints. Near a patch of low brush, she squatted and dug gently with a smoothed stick. Beneath the surface, she found a cluster of edible bulbs, fat, white, smelling of wet dust. She cleaned them with the edge of her thumb, placing each one in the pouch that hung from her waist. This was not for today, this was for tomorrow. The act of collecting was sacred, not because of the food but because of the thought of the future. She harvested hope, not just hunger. When she returned to the cave again, her hands were dusty, her fingernails filled with life. She washed them with water from a hollow stone, scrubbing until the ash had faded and the day had painted her again in its image. Her skin was no longer pale with powder, but stained with dirt and touch. She was a canvas for existence, marked by what she had touched, held, fed, and feared. A girl offered her a strip of dried fig bark, and she chewed it slowly, letting the sweetness linger. It stuck in her teeth and colored her tongue. For a moment, she sat near the fire and simply breathed. The sun had moved far enough to cast long shadows across the cave mouth. Light flickered over the ground in golden leaf-like shapes. She ran her fingers through it, pretending for a moment that she held something delicate and living. One of the children crawled into her lap without asking. His hands were sticky with sap, his face streaked with ash. She pressed her forehead to his, and they sat like that for a long moment, two creatures, still enough to be stone. In that silence, time disappeared. There was no before, no after, only breath and dust and warmth. If there was a god, she thought, it might live in that pause. She helped feed the fire again, placing more dried grass at its edge. The flames caught, quickly, flickering against the rock as though trying to speak. She watched them dance for a long time. The ashes it would leave tomorrow would be hers. She would wear them again. She would draw herself again from smoke and ruin. Every day, the ritual began in fire and ended in it. There was a rhythm to this life that she could no longer name but still carried in every step. When the stars returned that night, she rubbed her fingertips into the still warm ashes again. She didn't need them anymore for scent or protection, but she wanted to remember what the fire had burned and what it had spared. She smeared it gently on her arm, and it disappeared into her skin like a memory sinking into bone, a promise that she would rise again tomorrow, ready once more to draw her life from ash. The first sound she heard was not the wind, nor the murmur of birds, but the quiet stirring of the child against her ribs. His small feet twitched beneath the linen wrap tied around her waist, and she could feel the weight of him like a tether to the earth. He was not heavy, not in the way a burden is, but in the way memory is, warm, shifting, insistent. A reminder that she no longer walked alone. His breath was soft and wet against her back, and even in sleep, he clung to her like roots to soil. She adjusted the wrap with one hand, pulling the fabric tighter across her chest. It was a woven band of linen and plant fibers, frayed at the edges and darkened with smoke and time. But it held. It always held. Just as the child held her, unknowingly, without demand, without apology. He had not spoken yet, but he communicated, in ways more ancient than speech, in the way his toes curled when cold crept in, or how his head tilted when he sensed something invisible approaching. She bent low to the fire and stirred the embers. The child shifted slightly, but did not wake. His head rested in the small of her back now, just above her waist. As she leaned, the wrap adjusted itself with gravity, his little body swaying like a boat tethered gently to shore. She reached for a dried root to toss into the flames, feeling how his weight balanced her, kept her centered even in the crouch. This, too, was a kind of dance. One body, two lives. When she stood again, she cradled his foot in her hand for a moment, pressing her thumb gently into the arch. It was her quiet ritual, done each morning to remind herself that he was still real, still hers. So often, in dreams, he vanished, or worse, became something else. In waking life, he returned, as himself, tiny, tired, sacred. His skin bore a faint pattern from where the wrap held him close, like the faint imprints of woven prayer. She stepped out into the morning, ducking beneath the low edge of the cave's entrance. The wind touched her forehead, and the sun blinked, slowly above the far hills. With each movement, the child rocked gently against her back, his cheek nestled against her shoulder blade. He breathed in rhythm with her stride, a quiet metronome, a soft reminder that every step must be careful, because it was not taken alone. They passed the thorn bushes near the base of the path, where the ground softened into silt near the hidden stream. She reached down to pick some bitter leaf, careful not to jostle him too suddenly. He sighed in his sleep, adjusting one tiny hand against her spine. She felt his fingers curl. Even in dreams, he sought something to hold. He had never known a world without her warmth, without the heartbeat beneath her skin. The world outside would come soon enough. She moved toward the place where the earth opened into a clear patch of soil. Here, she could dig for bulbs, for grubs, for roots that healed. She crouched again, her knees bending, his body pressing a little tighter to her. She had learned to move with him, to shift her weight so he wouldn't wake, to angle her body so his sleep would remain unbroken. She dug with a curved stick, murmuring under her breath, not to him, not to the earth, but to something older that watched over them both. When she rose again, her pouch heavier with food, she tilted her body just slightly to rewrap the linen. More securely, the child murmured, his mouth opening, searching. She paused her walk and reached back with one hand, cradling the side of his head, stroking the soft patch near his crown. He calmed, returned to silence. Her fingers lingered there, unwilling to part too soon. There was something holy in the curve of his skull, as if it had been shaped by wind and fire, not bone and birth. She returned to the cave slowly, stepping over stones with precision. One misstep, and she could fall, not just herself, but the small world that clung to her. Inside, the women were boiling grains. She joined them, sitting near the fire with her legs stretched forward, the child still resting against her. As she leaned slightly forward, he stirred. His tiny hand reached instinctively for her breast. She loosened the wrap and guided him to feed, his mouth latching with desperate instinct. As he fed, her hand stroked the back of his head, smoothing the hair that stuck out in odd directions. He was warm now, fed now, wrapped again in the safety of her skin and her rhythm. He did not know yet what waited beyond her arms, did not yet know pain or distance. And she, though her body bore the calluses of survival, had moments like these where she could forget that the world had teeth. Here, at the fire, with his body pressed to hers, she was only mother, only vessel. One of the older women sat beside her, watching quietly. She had borne many children, but none still living. Her eyes, rimmed with red dust and lined from sun and sorrow, fell on the child as though studying a vanished species. She reached out a hand slowly and rested it on the child's foot, just for a moment, just to remember what softness felt like. No words passed between the two women, but the grief and gratitude did. When the child finished feeding, he nestled again against her back. She tightened the wrap once more, lifting him slightly and adjusting the fabric with emotion as old as time. It was emotion passed not by language, but by demonstrations in across fires, shared through need. The cloth hugged them both, linking their bodies in warmth and necessity. He yawned, his lips twitching, and fell asleep again, his weight slumping deeper into her. The rest of the day unfolded in steps. They cleaned skins, boiled herbs, fixed small breaks in baskets and tools. Through it all, the child stayed with her, sometimes awake, sometimes sleeping, sometimes crying softly and being rocked into silence by the steady swaying of her hips as she walked from task to task. His world was movement. His peace was her scent. His dreams were bound to the curve of her spine. In the afternoon, she carried him to the stream. She removed the wrap gently, lowering his body to the grass beside her. He blinked at the sun, confused, then cooed softly, grabbing at the air. She splashed water on his feet. He shrieked, surprised by cold, but did not cry. She laughed, a low breathy sound, and leaned down to kiss his wet toes. For a while, they stayed like that, just woman and child, sky and water, stone and shadow. After drying him in the warmth of the sun, she wrapped him again, this time with more care. He had grown heavier since the last moon, and the cloth needed more effort to secure. As she tied the final knot, she whispered into the folds of fabric not words, but sounds, a hum, a breath, a sacred vibration meant only for him. The wind carried it away before anyone else could hear. That was how love was spoken when speech did not suffice. That as evening approached, he began to stir again, his hands pressing into her sides, his head rubbing against her back. She knew the signs: hunger, discomfort, dreams breaking into wakefulness. She gave him what she could, adjusted the cloth, whispered against his skin, offered her body as haven. He did not ask, she did not refuse. There was no transaction, only the quiet contract of mother and child, older than pyramids, more eternal than names. At nightfall, when the stars began to bloom across the black sky, she sat near the fire, rocking slowly, letting the heat soothe the tiredness in her bones. The child had fallen into a deeper sleep, his breath long and low. His dreams now belonged to darkness. She kept him close still, even while resting. The wrap never loosened, her arms never strayed. She became still as the stones that lined the cave wall. Someone sang a low lullaby from the other side of the fire, the words soft and without form. The melody carried through the cave like wind through reeds, brushing the child's skin, weaving itself into his dreams. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the sound more deeply, to let it wash over her, to let it soak into the wrap, into the bones of her son, into her own spine. And when sleep did come, when the fire dulled into red hush and the stars fell quiet again, she did not untie the wrap. She slept with him still bound to her, for to unwrap him was to acknowledge separation, and there was none, not yet, not tonight. In the breath between her chest and his back, she carried not just a child but a future she could not yet name, and a love the earth itself would not dare to forget. Before the sun was even a thought behind the cliffs, she reached into the sleeping embers and stirred them with a branch that had long since blackened with use. The branch moved slowly, like an oar through smoke. Sparks rose, timid and red, like insects shaken from dreams. The fire had not died, only hidden. It waited, curled and smoldering, beneath its blanket of ash. She whispered nothing, but the movement of her hands was prayer enough, asking for light, asking for warmth, asking not to be forgotten by the flame. Her palms were dark with soot, her fingernails rimmed in the grey memory of yesterday's heat. Around her, the cave still slumbered. One woman stirred in her sleep. A child murmured. The air was cool but not cruel. It carried the scent of the rock, of dried herbs, and of skin, but all of that would soon change. Fire would chase it back. Fire would claim the space. That was its purpose, and hers was to invite it gently, like a guest who might refuse if startled. She leaned forward and blew softly, her breath threading through the coals. The small red eyes blinked brighter. She added dry grass, reeds, and a few thin pieces of dung that had been left to harden for this very reason. The smoke rose quickly, and she turned her face slightly to avoid the sting. blinking tears from her lashes. There was no beauty in fire-making, only need, only ritual. And still, it had Graysan ancient rhythm that she now danced with her fingers and breath. As the flame caught, she cradled it with twigs, building a small pyramid of fuel. The light grew slowly, crawling up her arm, touching her cheek. It made her skin look like copper, like sand warmed by the first stretch of daylight. She held her hand above the flame, not to test it, but to greet it. She turned her palm toward it and back again, letting it see her, letting it know who had fed it back to life. Fire, after all, remembered those who kept it alive. Others began to stir. The oldest woman crept toward her, dragging a woven mat behind. Her face, lined deep with time, caught the firelight like a dry riverbed. She sat near the flame and nodded once, not to thank, but to acknowledge. Fire was not a gift, it was a responsibility. It belonged to all of them, but it responded to the one who called it first. That morning, she was the caller, the ash singer. A girl approached with a cracked pot, setting it near the fire's edge. She poured a bit of water inside, dropping in slivers of dried root and grain. The pot hissed softly, a sound like breath against a sleeping ear. She fed more kindling into the flame, adjusting the rocks so the fire could kiss the pot's belly gently. The girl sat beside her. No words were exchanged, only the silent language of shared labor, understood through glances and smoke. Fire warmed their legs, their hands, their cheeks. It told them the day had truly begun. One by one, others came forward, stretching, yawning, scratching at their skin. They gathered in a loose circle, pulled by fire like stars to a sun. Its glow bathed them equally, erasing age, name, sorrow. For a moment, they were only beings of heat and skin, drawn to the hum of a life, not their own but somehow inside them too. A child reached toward the flame, and a mother caught his wrist before it got too close. The child looked confused, then afraid, then angry. But the mother held his hand firm, guiding it back to safety. Fire was not cruel, but it did not forgive. The child would learn. All of them had. Some learned with a burn, some with a scream, some with the long silence that followed when fire was gone and cold came crawling in. She poked at the base of the flame with a charred stick, breaking the blackened wood to reveal more orange inside. The flame responded greedily, reaching higher. She sat back on her heels, watching it grow. Not with pride, but with relief. It had taken was with them again. Its warmth would dry their clothes, boil their roots, cook their fish, and light their dark corners. It would guard them tonight, if fed well enough, if respected. Outside, the sun had begun its climb, but the cave still leaned into its own light, still favored the fire. That inside world stone, shadow, and flame felt older than the sun, more immediate. She rubbed her hands together, not from cold, but from ritual. The heat moved through her, not just in her fingers but in her chest. Fire always left its fingerprint, even when it burned clean. Later in the morning, she placed flat stones near the hottest part of the fire. Upon them, she would cook small cakes of grain and honey root, flattening the mixture between her palms and laying them down like offerings. The stones hissed. The scent rose quickly, sweet, earthy, warm. Others leaned in closer. Even the children, quieted, watching the cakes turn golden, crisping at the edges, bubbling in the center like breathing earth. She turned them with a carved bone spatula, checking the underside with a practiced eye. One cake cracked too early to dry, another stuck slightly too soon, but most were perfect. She had learned this skill not through instruction, but repetition. Over years, over loss, over hunger. Cooking was not kindness. It was precision born from desperation. Still, it was her favorite act. Fire transforming raw into ready, hunger into satisfaction, cold into memory. The cakes were shared evenly, broken by hand and passed along the circle. She ate hers slowly, letting the warmth of it settle on her tongue. It had the flavor of smoke and the sweetness of survival. Beside her, the girl who had helped earlier watched the fire, her eyes reflecting its gold. She would learn. She already was. The next time the fire died, it would be her task to wake it. The flame would listen to her breath and decide whether to rise. That afternoon, a storm whispered across the cliffs. The sky darkened slightly, not with rain, but with wind. Sand stirred in the distance. She shielded the fire with her body, gathering stones to close it in tighter. She added more fuel, tucking the flames beneath a small arch of rock. Others joined her, huddling close to protect the warmth. The wind howled briefly, then moved on. The fire survived, and always did if they helped it. As night returned, they let the fire grow tall again, not just for warmth, but for story. The flames danced, and the women did not speak at first. They only watched. Flames moved like creatures, licking the air, bending to unseen music. Shadows grew behind them, flickering against the cave walls, reminding them of other nights, other women, other fires now gone. The past returned in the light, and for a few minutes, they all remembered together. One woman told a tale, her voice low, crackling like the wood she fed into the fire. She spoke of a spirit that lived in the flames, one who stole coal from the bones of women and hid it in her belly. The child listeners leaned forward, eyes wide. Was it real? The truth did not matter. The fire made it feel real. Every pop, every hiss was a breath from that spirit. Every flicker a signal. She sat near the fire until her eyelids grew heavy. The child in her wrap had fallen asleep long ago. The heat pressed against her side like a sleeping animal. She fed one last twig to the fire, watching it catch. She whispered nothing, but her silence was thanks. The fire would fade slowly, its embers red as hearts. Its smoke would rise in tendrils like memory. And in the morning, the task would begin. Again, when she finally lay down, her body still smelled of fire. It clung to her hair, her skin, her wrap. She did not try to rid herself of it. Fire was not an enemy, not anymore. It had taken things from her in the past. Skin, sleep, silence, but it had given more. It had given life. Tomorrow, it would ask again to be woken, and she, ash-handed and gentle, would answer the call once more. When the horizon was still a bruise of dark indigo and soft clay, she rose without a sound. Her legs ached gently from sleep, her breath shallow as if stolen by dreams not yet returned. She wrapped her worn hide shawl across her shoulders, the edges embroidered with soot and time, and tied a satchel around her hips. Today was a walking day, and walking days asked for patience, quiet, and long thoughts. She stepped barefoot to the mouth of the cave, where the earth waited without judgment. The morning wind was thin, carrying with it the scent of stone and the memory of ash from the night's fire. She inhaled slowly, letting it settle in her ribs like a forgotten song. Around her, others stirred in their own rhythms, but this walk would be hers alone. No child clung to her leg, no old woman followed with questions. Just her, the bag at her hip, and the day unspooled before her like a long, unwritten verse. She moved across the sand with the gait of someone who had learned from animal steps, wide stance, eyes low. The earth was still cool beneath her feet, offering a kindness that would burn away by noon. Her first stop was near the old fig trees, their roots deep and gnarled, their branches still whispering from last night's wind. She pressed her hand to the trunk of the eldest tree and waited, not to ask, but to listen. Figs were never taken. They were offered if the tree agreed. Above her, birds stirred silent-winged and slow-beating. Their feathers shimmered briefly in the rising light, then vanished into the wind. She plucked a few dry figs from the tree's shadowed side, placing them gently into her satchel. One she peeled with her teeth, letting the sweetness fill her mouth with the taste of dusk-turned flesh. She chewed slowly, walking again. Food was not for hunger. Not yet. It was for rhythm, for balance, for remembering. Along the edge of the shallow stream, she crouched low, scanning the mud for prints. A fox had passed here, and a hare. Their paths overlapped like threads in a broken loom. She traced them with her finger, then stood and followed the stream, gathering small reeds with green-tipped heads and hollow stems. These would be dried, and plaited later, turned to rope, or braid, or toys for restless children. But now, they were only wild things, plucked with care. She bent to drink, cupping the water in both hands. It tasted of minerals and moss, of sky left too long in a bowl. The water clung to her lips like a blessing. She splashed some across her cheeks, brushing away the grit of sleep. When she arose, she carried more than water. The sound of the stream stayed inside her, soft and repetitive, like the hum of a mother's song with no words. Further along, she paused by a cluster of stones where mushrooms hid in the shadows. Not all were friendly. Some would sting the stomach, some would cloud the mind. But her fingers knew the safe ones, the kind that grew flat and wide, with soft stems and gentle colors. She gathered them into her satchel with reverence. Mushroom flesh bruised easily, It needed to be cradled like something half alive. She stepped carefully into the tall grasses, moving like smoke between the stalks. The wind shifted and carried scents to her nose wild thyme, crushed beetle, decaying wood. She crouched near a tangle of thorny bushes where berries lay hidden, red, round, and bitter-sweet. Her fingers bled lightly from thorns, but she did not curse them. Pain, like gathering, was expected. It gave shape to her task. By midday, her satchel was half full, and her breath had slowed into a gentle rhythm that matched the sway of the land. She climbed a low ridge to survey the wide plain below. Golden grass, rolling like animal fur beneath the sun, broken by scattered acacia and stone. In the distance, vultures circled something she did not wish to know. She turned away. This was not a day for death. This was a day for collection, for the whisper of life in small overlooked corners dotted the base of a sun-split rock. She found lichen the color of crushed jade, growing in spreading circles. She scraped a little with a bone sliver, careful not to wound the rock too deeply. This lichen would become dyecolor for cloth, or pigment for the cave walls. Next story. Her people still painted what they could not say, and sometimes what they dared not remember aloud. She passed under a canopy of thick-leaved trees, where a swarm of bees murmured from within a hollow. She stopped, watching them move in spirals of gold and shadow. She did not want their honey. Today, it would take fire, smoke, and courage. But she nodded to them, honoring their labor. The bees were gatherers too. Their hum was not unlike her own heartbeat, constant, hidden, determined. A small snake slithered across her path, barely the width of her finger. She froze. The snake did not see her as threat or prey. It moved on. She waited until the rustling ceased, then bent to pluck a small herb growing where the snake had passed. It smelled sharp, like teeth and metal. She crushed a leaf between her thumb and forefinger, letting the oil stain her skin. This plant could stop bleeding if it was new, or end a child if brewed too long. She whispered a name to the plant one. She did not say aloud in the cave. Every gatherer had secret knowledge, passed from women with dark eyes and no children. Plants did not speak in human tongues, but they listened. She carried that knowledge like a second satchel unseen, heavy, full of danger and medicine braided into one. Under the ridge, where the shadow cooled the earth, she rested. She pressed her back to the rock, letting its rough skin scrape hers. She ate another fig, this one soft and warm from the sun. She did not count how long she sat. There was no rush. The land did not hurry, so neither did she. Each breath was part of the gathering, each silence part of the listening. Sometimes the most precious things were found only when she stopped looking. A lizard darted across her foot. She did not flinch. Its tiny claws left no mark, but its presence told her the heat had peaked. It was time to turn back. She stood slowly, her knees stiff, her satchel now weighted with root, berry, reed, and leaf. She touched her belly, briefly empty, but not hollow. She would eat when she returned. She would feed others too. What she carried was not hers alone. The walk back was longer, not in distance, but in spirit. Returning meant re-entering the noise, the needs, the eyes of others. She passed the stream again, but did not drink. Passed the fig tree, but took nothing. Her body ached now, and the wind had shifted. It came from the east, dragging with it a dryness that scratched at her lips. She adjusted her shawl, shielding her face, her eyes focused on the path ahead. Near the cave's entrance, she paused one last time to kneel by a patch of blue flowers. They were useless, neither edible nor medicinal, but they were beautiful, and beauty had a place too, even if it could not be boiled or dried. She plucked one and tucked it behind her ear, where no one would notice unless they looked closely. Sometimes she wished they would. Sometimes she was glad they didn't. The shadows in the cave welcomed her without question. No one asked what she had found. They simply made space for her to sit, to unpack. Hands reached to sort through her findings. This root for stew, this leaf for oil, this berry for the elder's teeth. No word was wasted. Her satchel was emptied. With silent thanks, the earth had given, and she had gathered. That was enough. She sat by the fire as it rose again, stretching its thin fingers toward the roof. She held her palms to the warmth, but her mind was still outside among the grasses, the bees, the stream. Her feet still remembered the dust, and her hands still smelled of sap and thorn. She did not speak, but her body told the story. The walk had been made. The land had whispered. She had listened. Later, when sleep tugged at her lashes, she placed the blue flower on a small ledge near her sleeping mat. It curled in the dark, petals folding inward like secrets. She lay down beside it, the ache in her bones now soft. Tomorrow would be another walk, another gathering, another silence. But tonight, she had returned full. Before the sun had considered lifting its golden lid, the ground trembled gently under the hush of morning. She stood alone beside the half-emptied gourd, fingers tracing the dry rim, as if asking it why thirst came so quietly, yet stayed so long. In the darkness behind her, sleep still clung to her people, curled in their dreams, unaware that the world had already begun its asking. Water was not near. Water was far, and it waited only for the feet willing to chase it down. She wrapped her hips tightly, leather creaking like distant reeds in the wind. The gourd she carried had cracks. She had mended again and again with plant resin and ash, evidence of journeys past, of drops gathered and lost, of faith sealed into vessels that didn't always hold. She began to walk. The path was old, but always changing. The land remembered her, but not kindly. It had no interest in easing the ache of each returning footfall. Each step was its own vow. Her soles pressed into the hardened soil, where long evaporated puddles had once dared to glisten. Cracks spidered beneath her, like veins beneath old skin. The silence was not empty. It pulsed, it watched. Insects clicked somewhere to her left, unseen but working. Their movements mimicked her pilgrims, all of them, moving towards sources they could never fully drink from. By the third hill, her breath had deepened, and the sun was beginning its slow bleed across the edge of the world. She paused, not to rest, but to listen. The wind moved across the bones of the land, over dry stones and thorn trees too stubborn to die. She cupped her ear toward the horizon, not expecting sound, but hoping. Sometimes, water called, not in words, but in cool vibrations of the earth beneath her heel. She descended into a dry gully, where long ago a stream had once run free like a child without fear. Now, it was only memory-carved shapes in the walls, a ghost's drawing. Still, she followed it. Pilgrimage was never about certainty. It was about remembering where things once lived, and believing they might return. Her fingers brushed the smooth rock face, still cold from the night. It would warm soon, and with it, the false promise of water. She moved carefully, wary of snakes and sun-heated stone. In this place, thirst was the first enemy, and overconfidence the second. She had learned to carry her shadow close, not letting it stretch too far ahead. She passed a tree, its branches bare, its bark split in prayerful hunger, but at its base, a moss clung on, green and brave. She knelt, pressed her hand into it, damp, just enough to kiss her fingertips. This was not enough to fill the gourd, but it was a sign. Water had passed through here, perhaps recently, perhaps long ago, but water did not lie, even when it vanished. She wiped her damp fingers across her cheeks like war paint. This was a trail, however faint. She would follow. Hope inched forward beside her, one careful foot at a time. The sun had climbed higher now, unforgiving and deliberate. Her breath came heavier, shoulders bending slightly under the weight of heat and expectation. She passed animal bones, white, undisturbed, a gazelle, perhaps, or something smaller. Death here was quiet and clean, polished by time and sand. She did not speak to the bones. She bowed her head and continued. Far ahead, the land shifted again. Rocks gathered into a natural bowl, and within it, sand glimmered in irregular patterns. Her heart quickened. She approached. The wind carried a faint scent, mud, perhaps, or hope, masquerading as memory. She knelt and dug with her hands, slow, methodical. The sand was dry at first, then cooler. She kept digging. Her fingers struck clay, damp clay, not water, but its cousin. She gathered what she could, letting the moisture darken the inside of the gourd. She soaked strips of cloth in the dampness, sucking the water through the fabric, as if drinking sunlight from bark. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was proof. The water was here, hiding, resisting. She sat back on her heels and watched the sun through narrowed eyes. The journey had not ended. The pilgrimage always asked for more. She moved on, guided now by instinct and a soft hum in her chest that she had learned to trust more than sight. Her feet blistered in places she wouldn't name, but she did not slow. Time moved strangely. On water-seeking days, faster when she despaired, slower when she believed. She passed between two slabs of stone and entered a crevice barely wide enough to walk. Inside, shade blessed shade. She sighed and let the heat leak from her bones. Within the crevice, she found lichen blooming against the walls like secrets. She pressed her lips to it, and it gave a single droplet, sweet and almost unbearable. Her tongue memorized its weight. She did not cry, not yet. Tears were a betrayal to the pilgrimage, and their salt made her thirst burn deeper. She whispered, thanks to the stone, to the lichen, to whatever gods might have heard her in the silence. By mid-afternoon, her limbs trembled beneath her. The gourd remained light. Still she did not turn back. The map she carried was not drawn in lines, but in aches, in stories whispered by her grandmother's dry tongue, where the crow dips twice, where the grass kneels against the wind. She searched for these invisible markers, speaking them aloud, under her breath, as if invoking them would call the water up from beneath her. She descended into another hollow and stopped. There, under a half-collapsed ridge, lay a pool no wider than a woman's lap. It glistened, untouched. No tracks led to it. No beasts had fouled it. A sacred thing. She dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead to the dust before it. This was not a pool to gulp from. This was a pool to understand. She lowered the gourd, filled it slowly, gently, not disturbing its mirror-like face. When it was full, she drank a palmful, then sealed the gourd with a stopper made from cork and leather. The pool watched her. She felt it, as if water itself remembered her from before, from another lifetime, or many. It was never just thirst. It was communion. Every journey here was a ritual. Every return, a resurrection. She sat for a while, letting the silence settle again. No prayer was needed now. The water had answered. The way back was heavier, but not harder. Her steps now bore the rhythm of fulfillment. The burden of the gourd gave her purpose, not pain. She stopped again at the monastery and fed it a drop from her gourd. Just one, but it shimmered like gratitude. She smiled only slightly, but it stayed on her lips longer than most. When she returned to the cave, the others looked up. No words were exchanged. They saw the gourd. They saw the woman who had returned whole. They saw the dust on her face, and the steady in her eyes. Someone took the gourd. Someone else handed her a handful of berries. She nodded, settled near the fire, and felt her body cool from the inside out. Later that night, after the gourd was emptied and sleep had coiled around her limbs, she dreamed of the pool, not as it was, but as it had once been, wide as the sky, filled with stars instead of water. She walked across it barefoot, and each star hummed her name. And in the distance, the water kept calling. Even in dreams, the pilgrimage continued. A scream broke through the cave's hush before the sun had found its way over the rocks. It was not the scream of war or childbirth, but the sharp gasp of flesh betrayed by stone. A child, clumsy in morning play, had fallen along the jagged slope outside, and the sound brought her to her feet. No one waited for miracles in the wilderness. Pain had to be met immediately, like a bird caught mid-flight, its wings folding under breath alone. She emerged from the shadows, shawl dragging the dust behind her, the scent of old herbs still clinging to her fingers from last night's grinding. The boy sat on a flint slab, his legs streaked red and trembling. He was no stranger to cuts, but this one opened wide, and the sight of his own blood painted fear across his brow. She did not rush. Healing was not born from panic. It began with stillness, and then the act of really seeing what harm had come. She crouched beside him, brushing dirt gently from the torn skin. The wound was raw and thin, like a new mouth gasping open. She whispered the low sounds of comfort, not in language, but in rhythm. Her voice mimicked the wind between reeds, steady, forgiving. Then came the cloth hold, stained, but clean enough into water, saved from the last walk to the spring. It had grown warm in its clay jar, but it was still holy in its purpose. She poured it carefully, like she was giving drink to the wound itself. The boy winced. Pain always followed the blessing. She ignored his sobs and focused on her hands, now tinted with red. Blood was a reminder that the body remembered danger, even when the mind did not. She pressed the cloth against the gash, slow and deliberate, letting the pressure speak louder than fear. He breathed through his teeth, and she nodded yes. That was how it passed through. The poultice came next. She opened a leather pouch lined with dried greens, rough and curling with age. There was myrrh dust, still fragrant, crushed honeyroot, a scrap of onion flour, and thyme, stolen from a sunlit crack in the cliff. These were her spells, not for magic, but for memory. Each herb carried the story of survival, gathered under silence and stored with reverence. She mixed them in a shallow bowl with a bit of ash and spit, and pressed it into the wound. He asked if it would leave a scar. She told him all good stories did. She didn't speak to him like a child. Pain had already aged him for the morning. Scars were proof that something had tried to ruin you and failed. She tied the bandage in place, snug but not cruel, and let him rest on her lap for a while. His breath calmed. She stroked his hair with the tenderness one would offer to a creature that might someday remember this exact kindness. Inside the cave, others stirred. A few women peeked from beneath their cloaks, eyeing the boy's stillness and her stained hands. No words were shared. This was not news. This was life. Scratches and breaks, falls and bites. Every creature of the earth was familiar with the act of mending. It was no ceremony. It was continuation, something that had to happen so the next moment could arrive later. She cleaned her hands at the cave's back wall, where a cracked basin caught the morning drip from the ceiling. The water was cool and slow, too little to wash away all trace of blood, but that was never the goal. She kept the red beneath her nails like a quiet signature. Her work was not to erase the wound, it was to carry it gently through its own ending. Not all wounds were so clean. She remembered the birth 2 moons ago, when the mother tore from within and never stopped bleeding. The herbs were not enough. The fire was not hot enough. The chanting was not loud enough. The woman had died before night, and the infant with her. Sometimes the desert was not cruel, only indifferent. That kind of pain could not be dressed. There were other wounds she tended to, ones that never broke skin. A girl whose brother vanished into the night, taken by hunger or hyena. A man who refused to eat after losing a wife. An old woman who hadn't spoken since her daughter failed to return from the riverbend. These were injuries without poultice. They festered behind eyes and in dreams. For them, she brewed teas so bitter they shook the body, just to remind it was still alive. In the afternoons, she walked to the hills, always alone. There she gathered new leaves, small bones, dried beetle shells, and bark soaked in shadow. She believed no wound should be approached without something fresh. Each patient deserved the first of something, even if it was just a new scent or color. Healing, after all, was also storytelling, persuading the body that it would continue. She kept her bundles in woven sacks tucked high into crevices. The children were forbidden to touch them, though they always asked. Sometimes they pretended to be her, wrapping vines around one another, copying her chants, laughing. She didn't scold them. Imitation was its own kind of learning. And someday, one of them would need to take her place. Her own body bore many stories: a slice across the thigh from falling while gathering resin, a long gash down her back from a hyena she never saw coming, burns across her palms from a fire that leapt too high. Each mark was a sentence in the long paragraph of her survival. When she bathed at night, she whispered to them her old wounds as if they were kin. When a man once mocked her scars, she didn't respond. She simply pressed her fingers to the deepest one and met his gaze until he turned away. Scars made her no less a woman. They made her more a part of the world. The wind had brushed her, the earth had bitten her, and fire had singed her name onto her own skin. That was not shame, that was belonging. On some nights, she treated herself quietly, in the dark. She would mix salves for her own aches, knees that burned after walking, hands that swelled from cold. She did not speak of this to the others. The healer must always seem endless, but she knew that she, too, could break. So she stitched herself with the same care she offered strangers. The cave had seen many like her, women who held others' lives in their palms, who were asked for answers in the night. Some had gone mad from the weight of it, others had vanished into silence. She chose to endure, not because she believed in heroism, but because there was always someone new, bleeding. The work did not allow for disappearance. As the sun dipped behind the dunes, she checked on the boy. He was already playing again, his limp less dramatic now, though he shot her a grateful glance when he passed. She did not smile. Gratitude was not the point. If no one ever remembered her name but lived because of her hands, she would consider herself well lived. She sat then, alone, mortars in lap, grinding the next batch of resin and roots. The rhythm of pestle on stone matched her heartbeat. Outside, stars began to crawl across the sky like slow insects. The fire cracked behind her. The cave exhaled, and she whispered to the day's work, letting it fall into memory like all the wounds that came before. The sun did not wait for her. By the time her shadow returned to the curved wall of stone, morning had already unraveled its golden thread across the plain. The world outside the cave shimmered with heat and dust, and still she walked slowly, as if each step back toward the familiar mouth required permission. Her basket, slung low on her back, was heavy with thorned roots, twigs of sour bark, and the eggs of birds that nested in cliffs far from the safety of others. Her back ached, her fingers were dirt-streaked, but her breath was steady. She paused, just before the cave's lip, the rim where light met stone, where every return was a small rebirth. The cave mouth was not merely an entrance, it was memory. It was the old wound that never healed and never needed to. She stepped through with care, as if to not awaken something older than herself. Her sandals scuffed the dry threshold, and for a moment, all the air inside seemed to gather and hold its breath in recognition of her presence. Children's laughter stirred from deep within, echoing lightly along the curved walls. It was not loud, but it threaded through the silence like smoke. The scent of roasted seeds, mingled with ash and something herbal, hung in the air. Her presence did not interrupt the rhythm of the day. She was part of it, stitched into the pattern like a bone inside a limb. The cave, ancient and watchful, exhaled around her. She moved inward, allowing her eyes to adjust to the duskier light. It was always dim here, even when noon burned fiercely outside. The cave's walls were streaked with black soot from years of fire, and with handprints left by those long-gone generations had pressed their palms here, seeking to prove that once lived. She often touched them as she passed, aligning her fingers with those ghosts, letting memory meet flesh. An old woman nodded to her, her mouth too tired for speech, her eyes sharp as obsidian. A child tugged at her wrap, curious about the eggs she carried, and she gave the smallest one without a word. The child took it like a treasure, as if she'd handed over the moon in a shell. That was how things were shared, here, not always evenly, not always kindly, but always necessarily. Each act of giving was an act of continuing. Near the back of the cavern, a line of clay pots leaned into each other like gossiping figures. They held water, bitter roots, fire ash, and soaked grains. She added her herbs to a small niche above them, where dampness kissed the stone just enough to keep things alive. The cave had its own ecosystem, its own slow heartbeat. Anything placed within its walls had to respect that rhythm or risk being forgotten. She unwrapped the woven cloth from her shoulders and hung it near the fire pit, letting the smoke bless it with scent. Her skin glistened with the thin salt of the journey. She would not wash yet. First, there was sitting. First, there was breathing the space again. She took her place beside the fire, not quite close, not quite apart, her knees folded beneath her, and she rested her hands on her thighs like stone offerings. The cave mouth, though distant behind her now, still called faintly. It was a living edge, and she often listened to it, even from deep within. The wind that passed across its opening changed in tone depending on time, season, sorrow. Some days it sounded like a flute, others like a growl. But this day, it murmured, low and warm, like a voice remembering a forgotten name. She closed her eyes and listened. A man with a scarred lip walked by her, humming a broken melody. His tunic was streaked with mud from hunting. They did not speak, they rarely did, but he left a dried strip of meat by the edge of her mat, as he always did after returning from the kill. She accepted it wordlessly, chewing slowly, feeling the ache in her jaw fade with the salt and strength of flesh. Even food could be healing, if eaten with awareness. Small tasks waited. A girl came limping, her ankle twisted from chasing shadows too quickly. She pressed her fingers along the child's skin, locating the heat beneath the bruising, and bound it with woven grass and cooled ash. She spoke softly, not as healer to patient, but as breath to wound. Pain, like fear, had to be soothed into submission. The girl thanked her not with words, but with a resting head against her knee for a moment before slipping away. She moved next to the wall paintings, faded ochres and dull reds, images of the hunt, of childbirth, of stars that once appeared brighter than the earth itself. She ran her fingers just above the surface, never touching, only remembering. These were not stories for telling aloud. They were reminders of the weight time carried. Some lines had been redrawn again and again, like a chant repeated across centuries. The fire crackled behind her. A young boy fed it dried dung, arranging the shapes with solemn purpose. Fire was not just warmth. It was symbol. It was rhythm. It held the day inside the night. She watched him work, careful and deliberate. That too was healing a child, growing into his rituals without being broken by them. Every movement was a lesson in staying. A woman cried softly near the rear wall, rocking over a sleeping bundle that might not wake. No one rushed to her. Grief was not a fire to be extinguished. It was a cold to be endured. But still, the cave surrounded her with warmth. The sound of nearby stirring, the rhythm of the fire, the faint aroma of sweet root boiling, all of it said, "You are not alone, though you feel it." Outside, the sun had begun to soften. The light spilling in through the cave mouth had changed to amber, stretching the shadows long like stretched limbs. She stood slowly and walked back to the threshold. The view outside was endless dunes, shrubs, rocks, painted gold. It always reminded her that the world beyond could never be owned, only visited. She did not step out again. It was not yet time. Instead, she stood in the liminal light, her figure casting a strange silhouette between realms. Inside, the pulse of human need beat softly. Outside, the wind whispered of dust and forgotten bones. She belonged to both. The healer, the gatherer, the scar-bearer, the one who returns. Always, she returned. A girl approached, shyly, with a broken necklace in her palm. She knelt beside the woman and waited, saying nothing. She took the beads, small stones once polished by stream water long gone dry. She would restring them later, when the fire dimmed and the world turned quiet. But for now, she simply held them. The girl exhaled, and that was enough. Someone began to sing, not loudly, not for performance. It was a song to stitch the night together, a soft tune of teeth and tongue, passed down like smoke. The words were old, possibly meaningless, but the cadence was familiar. She closed her eyes and let the sound wrap her like linen. In the background, the cave breathed, and she breathed with it. Her fingers, though calloused and weary, still trembled slightly when she reached for the last of her herbs. There was always another mixture to make, another voice to soothe, another day to mend, but she did not resent the return. To come back to the cave mouth was not to end something. It was to begin again, and in beginning again, she remembered why she stayed. The cave had no judge, yet justice weighed heavy in its darkness. No gavel struck, no voice pronounced guilt or absolution. And yet, when silence descended like a shroud upon one among them, it was a verdict older than language. It was not spoken aloud, it was not declared with fire or stone. It simply was a turning away, a breath held too long, a bowl of food passed but never warmed, and she, once loud with songs and small laughter, now moved as a ghost made of flesh, no longer called by name. Her footsteps echoed in strange patterns. Where once the others had adjusted their space to welcome her presence, now they closed like clay underfoot, leaving no room. Even the fire turned its face from her, crackling with indifference, denying her its crackling warmth. She sat by the far wall, the cold one, where the wind sometimes slipped in through unseen cracks. She did not complain. That too would have been another crime. In silence, she endured. That was the only appeal left. She had not killed, not as one would expect, but she had said what should not have been said, a truth no one wished uncovered. Her tongue had once been praised for song, for prayer, for the naming of herbs and sickness. Now it was remembered only as the thing that birthed disquiet, and so they quieted her not with ropes, not with stones, but with the ancient sentence. Absence within presence, alive but excluded, breathing but no longer part of the breath. She still rose before the others. She still crushed bark and ground seeds. Her hands still healed. Her eyes still searched the sick for signs of fever. But no one thanked her anymore. They received her aid like one accepts wind on a hot day, without gratitude, without gaze. When food was passed, hers came last. When rest was needed, her mat was shifted subtly farther away. She belonged to no one, not to the children, not to the fire, not even to the cave. Outside, the desert didn't care. When she walked to fetch water, the sand did not turn from her. The sun blistered all skin equally. The lizards darted from her shadow like they would any other. Even the trees, gnarled and dying, did not judge. She often lingered there, letting the silence stretch over the land instead of coiling inside. Her chest, out there, silence was natural. It was inside the cave that it screamed. She spoke only to herself now. whispered thoughts into her palm, as if it were a listening ear. She sang lullabies to the sleeping rocks, not to soothe others, but to remember what her voice used to feel like. Words became precious like dried honey. She counted them out sparingly, afraid that if she let them flow too freely, they would drain her of the last parts that remained unbroken. One child still looked at her, a girl with eyes too large for her face, and a quiet hunger for stories. But the child's mother pulled her away each time, scolded her without sound, punished her with narrowed glances. So the child stopped looking. The eyes became like all the others, glassy, avoiding. She missed those eyes. They had been the last mirror of her humanity. Now, even that was gone. Nighttime was worst. The cave fell asleep slowly, breath by breath, and all that remained was the press of others' dreams against her loneliness. The snores, the shifts, the coughs, all of it reminded her that life went on without her. Sometimes she imagined standing up and walking out, walking far enough that even the cave forgot her, but her bones were still part of it. Her ash was already woven into the floor. Leaving would be a second death. She kept making medicine. Her hands knew nothing else. Fingers worked even when the heart did not. She laid bundles of mint near the children's mats, rubbed fever balm into the cracked feet of the old. And though they did not thank her, they never refused her touch. That was the irony. They needed her, they used her, but they did not want her. Her existence was utility stripped of affection. Sometimes she pressed her ear against the wall. There, the cave whispered things no one else seemed to hear. The stone remembered the time before them all, when it had cradled wolves and swallowed fire. It told her she was not alone. That silence too had memory. That exile was not the same as erasure, and so she stayed, listening for echoes in stone. When no voice would echo her name aloud, she lit her own small fire now, near the rear, where shadows clung thickest. It was not for warmth, but for symbol, a flame that recognized her. It danced, weakly, shivering in the cave's breath, but it lived, and when no one else spoke to her, the fire did. It told her she was still here, still breathing, still burning, in the way dying embers do, quietly, defiantly. One day she found a bone flute half buried in ash, old, cracked, perhaps once played in ritual, now forgotten. She cleaned it, breathed into it. The sound was broken, but it was sound. It quivered against the silence like a moth against glass. She played for no audience. She played for the air. And slowly, the flute learned her sadness and turned it into tone. She had found language again, that when she bathed at dawn in the outer stream, the water did not flinch. It lapped at her as tenderly as ever. There were no ripples of avoidance, no judgment in the current. She poured water over her hair, over her arms, over her belly where no child had ever taken root, and for a moment she was part of the world. Again, part of something unbroken and indifferent to shame. The cave mouth framed her figure at dusk. Sometimes the others saw her silhouette against the dying light and mistook it for something sacred, a ghost, a guardian, a goddess once wronged. They would not admit it, but their eyes flickered toward her in those moments. And in those moments, she stood tall, knowing the silence had not taken everything. She sang again quietly, into her cupped hands, burying the sound deep into her mat, so no one would accuse her of disturbing peace. But peace was a lie told by those who benefited from silence. What she sang was not defiance, it was survival. Like a bird trapped in a jar, still trying to chirp, still remembering that sound had once saved lives. One night, someone left a carved bead on her mat. No name, no thanks, just a bead, etched with the symbol for rain. She stared at it for a long time, longer than she should have. It could have been a mistake, a child's accident, but it was something, a fracture in the wall, a reminder that silence was not always solid, that it could be chipped. She began wearing the bead around her neck, not for beauty, but for hope. It lay against her chest like a memory. She did not smile, but her shoulders lifted a little higher when she walked. Even small signs could bear the weight of years. The others noticed. They said nothing. But in the corners of the cave, silence shifted slightly, like a sleeping animal, twitching in its dream. When the oldest woman died, the ritual was offered to her, to wash the body, to bind the limbs. It was tradition, and traditions sometimes forgot to be cruel. She did it carefully, singing the burial song through her breath. Others watched. Some wept. No one stopped her. For the first time in many seasons, her hands were visible again, not just useful, but necessary. And afterward, someone handed her a warm stone to sit on, small, but intentional. It meant she could sit with them during the grieving. She did, quietly. She did not speak. They did not speak, but they let her stay. And in that moment, silence was no longer a sentence. It was a language of return. A slow, uneven healing. She had not been forgiven, but she had been heard. There were no alphabets etched in their cave walls, no scrolls wrapped in reeds, no ink upon pressed bark. But they had language. Their language moved through the fingers, danced across dried sinew, curled along gut threads, spun fine and tight. They spoke through loops and pulls, through silent hours hunched in shadow, threading meaning between purpose and patience. She sat with the others now, in the circle that wove, their silence stitched with breath and resolve. They used fiber stripped from wild flax, bark softened with hours of beating, strands combed and separated like lines in sand. The act was ancient, older than memory, passed not in words but in movements. You learned by watching, not by asking. You were given a task and told nothing else. If your hands disobeyed, your work would unravel. It was not punishment, it was nature. The thread only listened to quiet hands and a heart that accepted time. She had not woven in many moons. Her exile had stripped that from her too. But now, seated at the edge of the group, she was handed a bundle, dry, coarse, a test perhaps, or a small peace offering. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from muscles fading memory. She inhaled and closed her eyes. Let the thread speak first. Let her fingers remember what her voice had forgotten. The first twist was too tight, the second, too loose. But by the third, something returned. Her palms remembered the friction. Her nails remembered the anchor point. Her wrist, the rhythm. Around her, the others did not watch, but they knew. In that quiet of shared labor, knowledge pulsed without acknowledgement. Her presence was not protested. Her fiber was accepted into the collective braid. There was no central leader, no voice dictating the pattern. The women wove as a murmuration moves instinctively, together, without collision. Threads from different hands would meet at the joining knot, and no one needed to declare it. It simply became. Each woman held a part of the whole. Together, they stitched utility into being. Nets to catch fish, bindings for wounds, slings to carry food or children. The cords of existence. She worked into the fading day, and when her eyes burned, she did not stop. Rest was a language she had forgotten, but the thread welcomed her, always. It asked nothing, only that she be present. It carried no rumors, it spread no judgments. In the language of threads, only the work mattered. There was comfort in that comfort she had not felt in many moons. Some knots were meant to be hidden, buried beneath layers. Others were left visible symbols to the knowing eye. In time, she learned which thread colors marked mourning, which loops meant marriage, which open weaves declared fertility. Every woman's hands said something, though her lips never would. They told of longing, of loss, of preparation, of survival. No two nets were the same dot. She began adding her own mark, small asymmetries, loops like spirals, borrowed from the curve of snail shells, or the twist of wind-blown branches. At first, no one remarked on them, but eventually a younger woman copied her curl, then another, and like seeds in soft earth, her pattern grew. She said nothing. She needed to say nothing. Her voice now existed in thread. At night, she dreamed, in fiber, not in words, not in faces, but in endless cord looping into forms. Dream snakes twined around dreamfish, slings wrapped around the moon. In these dreams her hands worked without pain. Her mother was there too, not as a ghost but as rhythm itself, her hands guiding from behind, correcting angles, softening knots. She wept in sleep. No one saw. Children sometimes watched the weaving with bored eyes, but some lingered. They mimicked the women's handshapes with sticks, learning through play what they would one day know by duty. One child, the same girl, who had once gazed at her in exile, now sat closer. She did not touch the thread, not yet, but she listened with her body. One day, she would weave, and the patterns would remember her. She began to carry bundles of thread even outside the cave. When she walked to collect water or forage, her hands stayed busy. It calmed her mind. It reminded her she was part of something larger, something that spanned beyond caves and days. Threads bound not just objects, but people. Her loneliness, once sharp, had dulled into something soft and endurable. The eldest among them had arthritic fingers now, bent like twisted twigs, but she still wove, slowly, with pain, and yet her knots were still truer than most. It was she who noticed when a pattern had been repeated from a dream. She who recalled that a certain loop had once signified protection against sickness. She who held memory in muscle, not in voice. When one woman bled too long after childbirth, and the herbs failed to stop it, it was not medicine but thread that saved her. A tight binding across the belly. Firm knots soaked in boiled bark. The baby lived. The mother did too, barely. And in that moment, they all remembered that the thread did more than hold it healed. There were days the wind howled too loud for talking. On those days, they did not mind. They sat together, weaving beneath pelts, their hands louder than voices. When storms blew sand into the mouth of the cave, they tightened their circle, shoulder to shoulder, thread between them, and in the hush of labor, they found safety. The storm could not unravel them. Sometimes, she traced the edge of a net and imagined it as a map, not of land, but of time. This knot marked a death, that one, a birth. Here, where the thread had been doubled, was a year of drought. Every tangle told a story, and though none would recite it aloud, they would know. The net was memory, just not in letters. Its grammar was tension and released. She started leaving small woven charms by the sleeping matza spiral for protection, a knot for calm, a braid for good dreams. No one asked why, no one removed them. It became quiet ritual, unnoticed yet acknowledged. One morning someone left one near her mat. A simple loop dyed with crushed berries. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. She tucked it into her chest wrap. There were still those who did not speak to her. That would not change, but the language of threads had no enemies. A net made from many hands did not judge the knots. It only held, and she held, and was held. When one woman's child went missing for a day, it was she who knotted the net. They used to find the boy near the ridge. They did not thank her, but they didn't refuse the net. Over time, she taught to younger girls to weave a specific knot, meant to mimic the shape of a hawk's wing. It was harder than it looked. They fumbled, they cursed. She smiled behind her teeth, guiding them with patience. It took days, but they mastered it, and they showed it off to the others. The elder nodded once. That was praise enough. When the time came to build a new sling for carrying dried meat, the task was given to her without ceremony, not as a favor, but as a right. Her sling was tight, balanced, built to last, and when they filled it, no one questioned its strength. That night, she hung it on the wall beside the others. Her work was part of the wall again. She no longer looked for conversation. She had found her voice in thread, and when she held a finished piece, she held not just utility, but belonging. Her exile had unraveled her spirit, but each loop, each knot, had rewoven it, stronger, quieter, true. Sometimes, alone, she would weave nothing useful, just patterns, shapes, lines that bent like dreams. She called it her secret cloth. No one saw it, no one needed to. It was her prayer, her confession, her song, made not of sound, but of touch. In it, she was still a woman, still worthy, still whole, and when the firelight struck the wall just right, the shadows of their weaving stretched tall. Women made of fiber and flame, moving in rhythm, breathing without speaking, singing with their hands. In that flickering silhouette, her place was carved, her voice eternal. For the language of threads, once spoken, never truly ended. They had no mirrors beyond still water, no pigments beyond what the earth offered. Yet they carried stories on their skin, not in vanity but in vow. The lines that danced across their bodies were not ornaments. They were oaths, wounds that had learned to stay, symbols of belonging, silent flames of memory. She saw them first on her mother's armbands of ochre and soot, curling like vines, dense like breath, silent like the stars above. The ink was not ink but blood mixed, mud, charcoal, powder, berry juices, spit, and pain. The tool was not metal, but thorn, fishbone, or sharpened flint. The sting was real, but it was not punishment. It was invitation, a kind of threshold. You did not ask to be marked. The women knew when you were ready. One day, the hand reached out and pointed. The rest of your life had already begun. The day they came for her, it was dusk, a purple dusk, where firelight weaved with shadow. She had not spoken much that morning. Something had settled in her chest, like a drum too far from the fire. She had braided her hair without knowing why. Her hands trembled, but she kept them, steady. When the eldest woman placed a warm stone in her lap, she did not ask what it meant. She knew. They began with a song, not one sung aloud, but hummed low, like breath on the edge of grief. It rose and fell. A wave passed from woman to woman. It was not about joy. It was not about beauty. It was about time, pain, and return. The lines drawn on her skin would not tell who she was, but what she had endured, where she had returned from, and who had stood beside her in that return. The first puncture was at her wrist, near the place the thread often cut when woven too fast. It bled quickly. The elder pressed dark earth into it, mixing the past with the present. She bit her lip, not because of the pain, but because it felt like remembering something she had never lived. Each prick thereafter was rhythm: stab, press, wipe, breathe, and the line began to form. A line that had no end. It curved upward along her forearm, jagged, then smooth, then a branching mark, like the crack in old bark or a river seen from above. It told the story of her exile, though no word was spoken when she cried. They let her. One woman placed a hand on her back, another placed a palm on her head. The hand said, "You are not alone. Even your scars will have company." The ink changed color midway through. They switched to red pigment, something pulled from the cliffs beyond the cave mouth. It was a rare hue, reserved for grief that had not yet faded. She did not protest. Her arms accepted the story. Her blood did not refuse the ink. When she looked down, she saw not herself, but every cave she had slept in, every root she had chewed, every night she had wished for a name. There were no mirrors to admire the work. She only knew what was drawn by feel. She traced it days later with her fingers in the dark, learning it like a map. The notch at her elbow, her first loss. The wave near her wrist, the hunger moon. The thorn shape on her shoulder, the man who never returned. It was memory turned flesh. A scar she chose. Other women bore their own patterns: braids down the spine, dots on the cheeks, circles over hearts. They shared meanings only through gesture. A woman once touched another's neck, gently, as if offering silence. Another ran a finger down a forearm, ending in a tight curl, signaling survival. You learned over time. There were no guides, only patterns and pain, and the patience to see them. The markings changed how others saw her. Some avoided her gaze, sensing the depth of the red. Others nodded slightly as she passed, a recognition she was no longer only flesh. She was record. Her skin now bore chapters. No mouth had spoken. Even the children looked differently, perhaps sensing the weight she now carried. The silence around her was no longer fear, it was respect. She began to notice the older women's tattoos more closely. One bore a symbol like a star split in half. Another had a ladder spiraling up the side of her neck. When she asked softly, with her eyes, the woman tapped her heart, then her belly, then looked away. It was enough. The language was complete in its silence. These marks were not decorations. They were prayers that could not be forgotten. A girl of 9 watched her one morning, eyes wide, following the red that curved beneath her shoulder. She smiled. The girl reached out, but hesitated. She nodded, and the small hand touched gently, as if reading with fingertips. One day, the girl whispered. She said nothing, but she knew, yes, one day, the fire would choose her too, and time would right itself again. When a woman died, they did not speak her name, but her body was washed in oil, and the tattoos were traced in ash. They said it was so the ancestors could recognize her. In the next world, the ink still glowed beneath skin. It was how they found each other in the dark. The marks outlived voice, outlived memory. They were the soul's own alphabet. She sometimes sat alone near the entrance of the cave, pressing pigment between stones, not to tattoo, but to remember. The red powder between her fingers felt alive. It whispered of women long gone, who had once wept and woven and walked the same path. She mixed it with water and painted stones, not with shapes, but with feeling: pressure, swirl, release. Marks only she could read. One evening, when thunder cracked above the cliffs, a young woman was chosen. She cried not from fear, but from anticipation. As they sang the first breathless note, she saw herself again years ago, kneeling before the fire, skin unbroken, heart trembling. And she knew then what her own markings had meant all along. Not pain, but passage. They never told the men that meanings, not because it was forbidden, but because it was not theirs to know. The markings were made for endurance, for blood lost and found again, for pain that birthed, and for silence that listened. Men had their own sin-scarred knuckles, missing teeth, bent noses, but they were born of clash. Hers were born of returning. Time moved differently once marked. Each sunrise did not begin fresh. It layered itself over the lines on her skin. She became witness to herself, her shadow now always slightly altered by the memory she wore. There was no erasing, but there was comfort in that. The story was now too deep to wash away. Sometimes she'd touch the ink just before sleep, pressing into it as if into a wound, not to hurt, but to remember that it had healed. The pain was once unbearable. Now it was strength. She carried it like warmth in her blood. Even as her body changed, her story stayed. Even when her voice trembled, the lines never did. And in her final years, when her hair grayed and her back bent, she was still asked by girls what her tattoos meant. She never answered. Instead, she took their hands and pressed them to her arm. "Feel it," she would say. "If it speaks to you, it is already part of you." The girls would close their eyes, their breath soft, and listen not with ears, but with fingertips. And when she finally passed, they wrapped her not in hides, but in thread woven with ash and dye. Her skin was not buried in darkness, but carried to firelight. Her lines glowed as if newly drawn. Her silence became song, and every woman who bore ink remembered, the story is not over. Time tattoos us all, some with pain, some with love, all with return. There were no clocks, no calendars, no stone etchings that counted down the moons, but still, they knew. They knew when the winds would change and when the sun would tilt ever so slightly in its arc. Their clocks were shadows cast by trees and bones, smoke trails in morning air, and how the stars hesitated just before dawn. For the cave women, the sky was not a mystery, it was a mouth that whispered. She first noticed the sky changing in her 7th season, when her mother's hair held a grey she had never seen before. The nights were no colder, but something in the wind said to gather more roots. The stars seemed to hum longer, and the birds, those shrill keepers of time, were flying not in twos but in flocks, as if rushing towards something unseen. Her ears opened, but it was her skin that listened. They said the sky was a skin above the world. What it bore: clouds, wind, fire. Ash was how it spoke to those below. It carried moods, and like a mother, it could be calm, furious, distant, or watching. The elders read the sky like others read faces. A torn cloud in the east meant loss. A thick purple haze meant death would pass close. A single bird flying alone meant someone would not return. At night, the sky pulled them into its breath. Not every woman dared to look up for long, for to stare too hard was to risk remembering everything at once. The stars told of children lost, of love found beside rivers, of sisters who walked too far into the reeds. Some women closed their eyes when the sky was clear. Others whispered to it, begging not for answers, but for mercy. The first time she heard the sky truly speak, she was alone by the water's edge, hands stained with clay. There was no storm, no wind, yet a shiver passed through her, starting at her scalp, crawling to her toes. The sky above was pale, nearly empty, yet something in it pressed against her chest like a hand made of cold breath. She turned to speak to someone, but no one was there, only the sky. She began noticing its moods after that. On mornings when the clouds hovered low, the firewood cracked too soon. On days when the blue was thick and silent, the fish in the traps would come in threes. The rhythm was not consistent, yet it was faithful. You could not predict, but you could prepare. And so she began marking stones, smooth ones stacked near her sleeping spot, each representing a kind of sky dot. There was a song the women sang only on days when the sky cried slowly long. Thin rain that did not soak but kissed. It was not a song of sadness, it was a lullaby for the trees, to let them drink slowly. She hummed it once during a dry season, and the oldest woman placed a finger on her lips. "It is not time," she said. "Even the sky must be invited." And she never sang it again without first listening. There was a woman who danced when thunder came. She was not mad, as some said, but simply more attuned. She said the sky trembled like a birthing woman, and if one danced in rhythm with it, you could ask questions without words. So she danced, arms raised, back bent, feet soft against the dirt, while lightning tore open silence. And when she finished, she always walked in silence for 3 days. When a child was born, they looked to the sky. If a bird passed overhead, they gave thanks. If a cloud passed too quickly, they burned dry leaves. If the stars were hidden for 2 nights, they whispered extra prayers into the infant's breath. The sky did not decide fates, but it colored them. It painted the day's meaning before the sun even climbed fully from its sleep. Sometimes she would climb the hill above the caves, past the thorn bushes and bleached bones of deer, just to sit in silence. There, with no trees to block her view, she would lie flat on her back and watch the sky move, not in speed, but in feeling. A soft rotation, a distant swirl, a sigh passed down through time. Her heartbeat often slowed there, matched by the pulse of clouds moving centuries old. When her sister died during the cold moon, the sky held a violet bruise for 5 days. No birds crossed it, no stars shone. The wind moved sideways, not forward. She watched the sky every night of those 5, waiting for a sign her sister had reached the beyond. And when a single shooting star dragged across the black, she wept and whispered, "You made it." The sky did not answer, but it never had to. Men listened differently. They counted the days by the feel of soil or the presence of game. Their eyes were on the earth, but women, they felt the air tighten before a storm. They knew when the light had shifted, even if the warmth remained. They gathered roots early, not because they feared shortage, but because the sky had closed its eyes slightly, and that meant soon something would leave. On certain nights, the women gathered in a circle and pointed upward, each describing a different piece of the sky as if it were a familiar garment. "That part is my mother's laugh," one said. "That shape is my daughter's last breath." They wove constellations from memory, not astronomy. Each group had different names for the same cluster of stars, but no one corrected another. The sky belonged to whoever needed it. She once met an elder with a tattoo of a spiral around her navel. "What is it for?" she asked. The woman tapped her forehead. Then the sky. "Storms," she said. "They circle like that. So do thoughts. So does grief. But if you walk into the center, you find quiet." The younger one never forgot that. Every storm thereafter, she pictured herself not outside the wind, but inside the calm dot. There was no teaching for listening to the sky, no ritual that made you an expert. Only time, silence, and a willingness to unlearn. You had to forget your name, your needs, your firewood count. You had to lie down in the dark and let the stars tell you what mattered. Some nights they said nothing, other nights they screamed with beauty, and still other nights they simply wept for you. Birds were the sky's fingertips. When they scattered in spirals, a birth was near. When they flew close to the ground, something was hiding in the trees. When they flew in silence, their wings speaking in patterns, it was time to pray. She began mimicking them, not with sounds, but with movement, learning how to walk like shadow, pause like wind, and breathe like the empty air before rainfall. There was a night when no sky could be seen. Clouds, thick and black, devoured the moon. The women did not sleep. They held hands and listened. They said the sky had gone blind, and in blindness it dreamed. The fire was left low that night, and all words were swallowed. By morning, when a single star re-emerged in a pinking sky, the women lit herbs and sang the song of finding. Children were taught to notice birds before they noticed their own names. They were told to sit still and count how many passed in a breath. This taught them patience. It also taught them the rhythms of the unseen. The sky had no rules, only signs. And if you watched long enough, it spoke, not clearly, never loudly, but in a hush that filled the ribs. By her 20th winter, she no longer feared storms. She walked through them, arms uncovered, face tilted to the weeping sky. She whispered to it not with requests, but with gratitude. "Thank you for carrying what I cannot name," she'd say. "Thank you for remembering the things I forgot." The wind often answered with a gust that pushed her forward, as if nudging her toward something unnamed. When her blood stopped coming, she knew the sky would begin preparing her for silence. The stars became sharper to her eyes, the wind more fragrant, even the darkness seemed more honest. She began speaking to the sky, not as a guide, but as a friend preparing to say goodbye, and it listened, as it always had. For those who learned how to listen. In her last days, she lay beneath an open sky, not on hides, but on cool stone. She asked for no songs, only silence. And when her breath faded, a single cloud opened above her, letting one shaft of light fall onto her chest. The women gasped. The sky had answered, and they knew, from that day on, when they needed her, they would look up not for shapes, but for silence. The arch was not built, it had always been there. A curved bone of earth, half swallowed by moss and wind, reaching from one side of the clearing to the other. It looked like the skeleton of a god. Beneath it, the women cooked, not because the arch offered the best shade or the softest ground, but because meals made under its curve tasted like memory, deep, round, and warm. It was not shelter, it was blessing. They said the first fire ever lit in their world was lit under that arch. A woman had found dry bark in the belly of a fallen tree and a flint that sparked blue. She had no children yet, but when the flames rose, they danced like future daughters. She cooked roots that deigned nothing sweet or sacred, yet even the old ones swore the smoke smelled like rain after drought. That's where it began. Each generation left something beneath the arch. Not gifts, but traces, scratches in stone, burnt bones from feasts, small teeth tied in leather. None were removed. They remained as part of the floor. When girls began to cook, they pressed their palms into the earth there and whispered their names to the fire. Not loudly. The flames disliked pride, only breath-soft offerings of self. The act of cooking was never rushed. Flames had to be earned. The stones that circled them had to be placed just so, not tight, not loose, but listening. You couldn't cook well if your soul was frantic. The arch did not allow frenzy. Its shadow slowed the blood. When women crouched beneath it, stirring stews or pressing berries into paste, their breath came deeper, their hearts quieter. The smoke never rose straight there. It curved, like the arch, spiraling up, sometimes dancing back down to kiss the skin. When meat was roasted, it crackled like soft laughter. When herbs were boiled, the steam coiled like fingers asking old questions. Sometimes, the smell alone would call back men from hunting paths or children from streams. It had its own voice, that smoke. A woman once whispered to the arch when her child would not eat. "He fears fire," she said, tears soaking her cracked lips. She left a crushed fig in the hollow between two stones. The next evening, as she stirred lentils, the child approached and dipped his fingers in the pot. No words, just hunger awakened. She never claimed magic, only gratitude. The arch, it seemed, knew hunger to know. 2 meals were ever the same beneath the arch. Even when the ingredients repeated, the mood of the day flavored everything. A stew cooked during sorrow tasted different than one made in laughter. Fire was not a tool, it was a guest, and guests brought their own stories. Some nights, the food felt light, as if it could rise and sing. Other nights, it stuck to ribs like promises too heavy to keep. Men sometimes helped gather ingredients, but it was the women who dictated what became a meal. They tasted the air, felt the breeze, and chose flavors that suited the sky. On cloudy days, they added mint to lighten the tongue. On dry days, they used dried plums to awaken thirst. Their intuition was not mystical, it was inherited. Recipes, written in the palm lines of their grandmothers. There were days when no one was hungry, yet the fire was still lit. Those were memory days. They cooked not to eat, but to remember, to summon a voice, a face, a time when the arch had held another set of hands. On those days, the food was often untouched. Bowls sat full, cooling in the shadow, but the scent drifted far, and sometimes owls came early, as if the ghosts of the lost were being fed. Children were never shooed from the cooking space. They were taught from their first crawling year to sit and watch, to hold leaves, to press seeds, to smell each thing before adding it. Even the act of tearing a leaf was done slowly, as if asking its permission. There were no written recipes, only gestures, eye glances, and the occasional grunt of approval. Taste lived in silence. They cooked by rhythm, not measurement. The sound of boiling water told them when to add salt. The way a root bent when pressed between fingers told them it was ready. Their fingers were stained, rough, burned, but no one complained. Each scar was a chapter. Each cut a conversation with the flame. The women bore their wounds like jewels and showed them to no one. One woman only cooked with her left hand. She had lost the right in an accident as a girl, but under the arch, she moved like a bird winging through steam. Her ladle curved like a lullaby, and her bowls never spilled. She said the arch compensated that when one part was taken, another was sharpened, and no one ever questioned it. Her meals made even sorrow feel soft. When someone was dying, they cooked something sweet, not to mask grief, but to remind the tongue that joy once lived. Honey was precious, but it was never withheld, even if it meant scraping the last drops from old combs. The dying were fed slowly, one breath between each bite, the arch whispering above like a cradle made of stone. The food did not cure. It comforted. Storms could not touch the arch. Rain would hiss against the stones, but the fire never died. The arch curved the weather away. In deepest winter, women huddled close, wrapped in wool and smoke, cooking meals meant to stretch across cold nights, stews thick with bone, herbs tucked into ash bread, and roots mashed until they no longer resembled the struggle it took to dig them. On the warmest nights, they roasted figs and chewed wildflowers. The flames were smaller then, flickering like flirtations. Girls giggled between bites. Elder women leaned back on elbows and told stories of love met by riverbanks and hands held in darkness. The food was not the main event. It was a ribbon tying all of them to the breath of now. If a woman had been wounded by birth, by love, by loss, she was not allowed to cook until she'd rested beneath the arch, alone, a healing ritual. She would sit there with an unlit fire, hands resting on thighs, until the arch spoke, sometimes in the flutter of a bird, sometimes in a sudden gust. When she felt it, only then could she cook again. Not because she had been punished, but because fire deserved her whole. There were times when the fire would not start. Even the driest bark refused to burn. On those days, the women said, "The arch is fasting," and they fasted too, not in sorrow, but in reverence. They gathered, shared stories, sipped water scented with crushed mint, and waited. The next day, the fire would always return, and when it did, it crackled with delight, as if greeting a long-lost kin. Don't no woman ever cooked alone under the arch, unless she chose to. Company was common, someone to pass herbs, another to sing, a child to stir, but solitude was sacred. When one needed to think, to mourn, or to ask the arch questions only it could answer, she would cook alone, not in silence but in communion. The meal became her language, the steam, her prayer. Once, a traveler asked why they did not move the fire elsewhere. "It is just a stone," he said. The women only smiled. They offered him a meal made elsewhere. It was edible, yes, but flat, without echo. Then they offered the same meal under the arch. The man wept after the first bite. "What is this taste?" he asked. They told him, "Memory. The day a woman gave birth, the first scent she was given was not flowers or oils but food. Warm stew, held beneath her nose, to remind her she had not left the world, that her body was still tethered. She was fed with fingers, not spoons. Fire-fed nourishment, earthy and real. It brought her back gently, meal by meal. At the end of each season, the arch was cleaned it with water, but with breath. Women blew across its stones, wiped soot with linen, and left behind slices of fruit or drops of honey. No one said thank you aloud, they only bowed. The arch did not require worship, only witness. And it had witnessed everything: birth, grief, joy, and flame. Always the flame. The songs came before the language. That's what the elders said, their mouths trembling with a kind of awe. Before words were carved into clay or bone, before names were whispered across firelight, the people sang, not with syllables, not with phrases. They sang with breath and throat and silence, melodies that were remembered by the skin, not the mind. These songs carried no meaning, yet they were everything. Women sang while grinding grain, a low vibration, barely above a hum. It moved in waves, like the sea rolling inside their ribs. The younger ones picked it up without being taught. There were no lessons, only repetition. They did not sing for beauty. They sang because the motion of the work required rhythm, and the rhythm called the voice. When they stopped singing, the grain turned bitter, or so they said. Children heard these songs before they understood anything else. They were held against the mother's chest, the voice like a drumbeat beneath skin. These songs asked for nothing. They did not command or explain. They wrapped around the child like warmth, a lullaby that came not from the lips, but from somewhere deeper, a place even death could not reach. When those children grew, they sang them back without knowing why. No man could recall the beginning of the hunting song. It had no lyrics, just a sequence of guttural sounds, half growl, half call, sung in the morning mist before a hunt. It echoed off trees and stones, and animals seemed to listen. Some even paused, head tilted, as if recognizing it. It was said the beasts knew that song, not as warning but as kinship. They knew it long before spears were thrown. Some songs lived only in the evening. They were sung around the fire, just after eating, when the belly was full and the eyes heavy. These were slow, long-breathed sounds that stretched across stars. The fire cracked and answered. No one looked at each other while singing. They stared into the flames, into the dark beyond. The songs told stories the tongue didn't know how to shape. Old women sang while weaving. Each tug of the thread, each twist of the wrist, was matched with a tone. Not one the ear could always hear, but one that vibrated in the hands. When the cloth was finished, you could feel the hum in it, as if their song had been stitched inside the fabric. Robes worn with such cloth carried the sound with them, murmuring to the wind as the wearer walked. There were songs for the dying, too, but they were not laments, not sorrowful wails. They were barely their breathings, soft vibrations against the chest of the one fading. A sister, a son, a midwife, someone sat near, singing not to hold them back, but to guide them on. These songs were quiet enough that only the dying truly heard them. They went into the next place, wrapped in their softness. In the caves, where drawings curled on the walls like frozen breath, songs echoed long after the last note. Women who entered alone said they could feel the residue of sound pressed into stone. You didn't need to sing there, the cave remembered. If you placed your ear to the rock, you could hear the hum, as if the walls themselves were still vibrating from an ancient song sung in darkness. There was a song for water, not a praise or request. It was hummed when carrying pots to the river, when pouring water into cracked lips, when washing blood from hands. It was the same tune, always, though no one claimed ownership. They said it belonged to the river, that it came with the current and left with the flood. To stop singing it was to forget how to quench thirst. Sometimes, songs came unbidden. A woman working in silence would suddenly find her throat vibrating, her breath shaping tones that didn't belong to her. She would pause, not in fear, but in recognition. The song had chosen her. It passed through her like a wind carrying seeds. Afterward, she would not remember the melody, but others, hearing her, would carry it forward. No one argued in the presence of song. It was not forbidden. It was simply impossible. The moment someone began to raise their voice in anger, the air would thicken, and someone nearby would begin to sing, not to silence, but to shift. The tones would fill the space, slow the blood, calm the heart. Even the angry ones found themselves humming along, forgetting why they were clenched. There were places where song was louder, not because people gathered there to sing, but because the land remembered. A certain stone ledge above the valley, a hollowed tree with bark like flute holes, a path where deer had walked for centuries. When someone sang there, their voice seemed larger, as if joined by many others. Some believed it was the ancestors. Others said the earth sang back. Infants who could not yet crawl sometimes made sounds in sleep, little hums. The elders listened closely to these. They said the children were remembering songs from before birth, songs sung in the womb, or perhaps before that, songs from stars, from past lives, from the space between heartbeats. These tiny tunes were considered sacred. Mothers would hum them back during sleepless nights. Fire had its own music, not just the crackle, but the way the flame danced in rhythm with the voice. A woman once sang a melody so steady that the flames seemed to still, leaning toward her like listeners. No one could repeat that moment. It was not recorded, not remembered, but those who saw it wept, and for days afterward, the fire tasted different, less wild, more tender. One boy who could not speak sang constantly. From the moment he woke until his eyes fell shut, he sang, not with words, but with tones that made dogs tilt their heads and birds pause mid-flight. His songs became known by the names of the trees he sang beneath. That is the elm song, people said, or the rock face song. He never knew he was special. He just sang. When mourning a lost child, mothers sang into their own palms. They curled their fingers round the note and pressed it against their chests. This was not to bring the child back. It was to remember that once a voice had echoed inside them. The song made that echo real again, if only for a moment. Afterward, the palm was washed in river water. The song released into the current. Travelers who returned after many seasons brought new sounds. Not all were accepted. Some were too sharp, too loud, too full of ambition. But now and then, a foreign hum would slip into the village and find a home. Children would mimic it. Women would braid it into their grinding songs. The sound, once foreign, would soften, reshape, and melt into the bones of the old melodies. Birds copied some of the tunes. Not fully, but enough. A certain trill here, a swoop of tone there. People watched closely. When birds sang a human melody, it meant something had shifted. Sometimes good a child would be born, or rain would come early. Sometimes terrible a sickness, a snake in the granary. Birds did not create music, they borrowed, and their choice mattered. They never carved songs into stone. They knew better. Songs were meant to disappear, to rise, to echo, to die, to be reborn in another breath, another throat. Writing them down would flatten them, hold them captive. The only true memory of a song lived in the muscles, the way your body leaned with a certain hum, the way your fingers twitched at a forgotten rhythm. There were love songs, though they never said love. They didn't need to. A certain trembling pitch, a stretched note at dusk, a double tone during grinding it, was enough. The beloved would hear and know. No one spoke of these songs directly, but everyone knew when someone had been sung to. Their step changed, their eyes lit like embers. Their silence afterward was warm. A woman sang once during childbirth. Not a scream, not a chant, a single, continuous tone, drawn from the base of her spine to the roof of her mouth. It lasted longer than any breath should have. The midwives froze, listening. When the baby was born, it did not cry. It sang a soft gurgle matching the mother's note. That child would later become the keeper of dawn songs. Even in the desert, far from trees or water, they sang, lips cracked, throats dry, yet they sang. A rasping whisper that floated above the sand like dust. It gave no comfort, but it gave identity. In places where nothing lived, the song reminded the air that humans had passed through. The desert did not sing back, but it did not erase them. At the end of life, when the body was laid on woven mats, someone would sit nearby and sing one final melody. It had no name. It changed for each person. But always, it ended the same way, with a breath and silence. The breath was the final note. The silence, the applause. They believed that somewhere, just beyond the veil, the one who had died was now singing to. At the edge of the settlement, where the dust met the roots of wind-worn trees, children formed a circle each dusk. Not by command, not by routine taught through words, but through some deeper rhythm etched in their bones. They came barefoot, still with traces of flour on their cheeks, or red scratches on their arms, and without speaking, they joined hands. Some held tight, others barely brushed fingers, but the circle always closed, always formed, as if summoned by the very breath of the earth. They never began all at once. A single foot would tap, a knee would bounce, a mouth would hum a note only half heard. Then another child would echo it, not perfectly, but close enough. The rhythm spread like smoke, until all feet moved, until the dust between them lifted in pale spirals. They spun in slow orbits, not quite dance, not quite ritual, just movement, old as hunger, old as sunrise. It was never taught, it was remembered. Each child brought something. A stone rubbed smooth, a dried pod, a feather crusted with river mud. They did not speak of these offerings. They passed them quietly around the circle. Some sniffed them, others held them to the chest, eyes closed. These were not toys. They were keys to unseen doors, to dreams, perhaps, or to places they could never name. Adults watching from afar didn't understand, and the children never explained. Their games had no winners, no end, no reward. One game involved pointing, not with fingers, but with noses. They pointed to the sky, to each other's knees, to nothing at all, and then fell over laughing as if a great joke had been shared. Another game was played with shadows. They waited for the sun to stretch their shapes long across the sand, then tried to jump from one silhouette to the next. Without touching the in-between, they spoke in chants that shifted meaning with every repetition. Aya, aya, so we go, they'd say, spinning faster, then slower, then faster again, until the words became nonsense, and then sacred again. Some said these were the words of the first people, preserved only by the young. Others believed they were new, born fresh each evening, never to be heard again once darkness fell. Sometimes they told stories by blinking. A slow blink meant fear, a fast flutter meant mischief. Wide, unblinking eyes meant a story so serious it shouldn't be said aloud. They'd stare at each other in these silent narratives until someone broke into giggles or tears. The youngest child always believed every blink. The oldest tried not to show they believed too, but they did. Laughter was currency among them, not for approval, but for survival. If you could make another laugh, you secured your place in the circle, not in rank, but in belonging. One boy became legendary for making a stone laugh. He whispered to it, juggled it, kissed it, and the others swore they heard it chuckle. They passed it around for weeks after, hoping to hear that laughter again. They rarely used their given names. They called each other by sounds, nicknames, and sometimes just gestures. A tongue click for one, a throat hum for another. Names weren't needed when eyes knew eyes and hearts beat in rhythm. If a name was used, it meant something was wrong. A scraped knee, a missing friend. Names broke the spell, so they kept them tucked away, like knives too sharp for play. Their circle bent time. When they gathered, hours melted like honey on a hot stone. Parents called for them thrice, sometimes 4 times, but the children didn't hear. Or perhaps they did, and simply knew that time outside the circle moved differently. Inside, the sky stretched, the stars came slower, the cold waited patiently until the last song was sung. The earth beneath them kept their secrets. The sand where they circled bore the imprint of their feet, and every few days a new pattern emerged, a spiral, a wheel, a creature none could name. Adults would find these shapes and say nothing, brushing them smooth with their heels, unsure if they were sacred or accidental. The children never claimed them, but they always smiled when one vanished. One girl claimed she saw a shadow. Child joined them, not a ghost, not a spirit, just another child who belonged but had no name. The others didn't mock her. They made room in the circle. From that day on, one space was always left open, a gap wide enough for one more. Sometimes the wind moved through that space and stirred the dust differently. When it did, the children nodded. He's here. The circle taught without teaching. One boy learned to listen better. One girl learned when not to speak. Another learned how to cry without shame. There was no punishment here, no reward, just learning that soaked through skin like rain. They grew wiser without knowing it, their small bodies storing lessons that would one day guide them through births, griefs, and fire. Sometimes an older sibling tried to return to the circle, but the rhythm had shifted. Their feet were too heavy, their questions too loud. They stood on the edge, smiling with longing, but unable to enter. The children welcomed them with eyes, not hands. You cannot rejoin once you forget the silence between notes. That was the rule. Not spoken, not written, just known. The circle never formed during storms. Rain scattered the children like seeds, but after the downpour, they returned and danced in puddles, drawing circles with their toes. Mud became paint, laughter became thunder's echo, and in those dirty, dripping moments, the games became wilder, as if the sky had gifted them new energy. They called it the loud day, even if they never spoke of it aloud. They buried things in the circle, not out of sorrow, but of ceremony. A cracked bead, a bird's feather, a friend's lost tooth. Each burial was silent, small, and final. The earth became a museum, a keeper of tiny farewells. Sometimes they marked the spot with a pebble, sometimes with nothing at all. They believed the buried thing would dream on their behalf. Deep below, if a child wept within the circle, no one spoke. They touched her shoulder, hummed low, or simply sat close. Grief was not banished. It was invited in, seated, and offered space. Tears fell into dust and vanished, and when the weeping stopped, the game resumed, as if sadness had been absorbed into the pattern, made part of the dance. Animals watched them. Goats, dogs, sparrows. They stood still, as if mesmerized. A bird once landed in the center and hopped along with their rhythm. The children welcomed it with breathless joy, then never spoke of it again. They understood. Some things didn't need retelling. Some moments were gifts, and gifts must not be chased. They played with light too. Reflections from copper pots, shards of sunlight caught on fingernails, the shimmer of heat in the distance. One girl claimed she could catch light with her hands. She would hold her palms together, then open them slowly, revealing a shimmer of dust that seemed to glow. The others gasped, even if they knew it was only play, or maybe it wasn. Single quotes T. When night fell and parents finally gathered them up, some resisted, others ran to warmth, but every child left a piece of themselves behind. A breath, a footfall, a note half-hummed. The circle remained in silence, holding their absence like an ember holds fire. They would return. The circle always waited. Years later, some would walk past that place and feel a tug in their chest. they'd pause, unsure why their breath had caught or why their hands itched to reach out. The circle, though long unformed, still whispered to them, not in words, in longing, in rhythm, in the memory of dust and laughter. Some elders remembered their own circles, dimly, a certain stone, a particular chant, but they never tried to explain it to the young. They knew better. Explanation dulls the magic. Instead, they watched with soft eyes, letting the children rediscover what had always been theirs. One day, when the last of the old ones had passed, and the youngest child had grown tall, the circle would form again. New hands, new feet, new laughter, but the same song, humming through the bones of the earth. A song no adult could sing, a song that needed no words. In every village, in every camp nestled beside slow rivers, or crouched near the bones of ancient rocks, there was one whose back curved like the crescent moon, and whose hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of years. This one was the eldest not by counting seasons, but by how many voices lived in their silence. When the fire was lit each dusk, it was the eldest who leaned close, whispering not words but breath, as though rekindling something much older than flame. The others gathered only after that breath had taken hold, when the flames danced like remembering children. They never rushed the eldest. Even the most impatient youth, who dared to interrupt every rule and ritual, waited in stillness when the eldest knelt. The fire needed more than wood. It needed the memory of hands that had lit 1,000 nights. It needed the tremor of someone who had watched too many suns rise and fall without flinching. Their face was like bark, layered and cracked with time, but their eyes held no dimness. They were mirrors, twin pools that reflected every burial, every birth, every storm that had ever kissed the roofs of their world. When they looked at you, you were not seen as you were, but as all you had been, and all you would one day become. It was this gaze that held the tribe together, more firmly than rope or law. Children sometimes feared the eldest, not for harshness, but because they carried no softness in their words. They told truths the way stone tells a story without apology. When a child lied, the eldest did not scold. They simply looked, and that look melted pretense faster than fire could melt wax. No one dared disbelieve the one who had lived so long that dreams and memories often blurred into one. Every night, the eldest told a tale, not from memory, but from the air. They would sit, cloak gathered around their legs like folded wings, and wait for silence. Then, with a whisper like wind over reeds, they would begin not with once upon a time, but with a phrase as old as dirt. There was, and there was not. And just like that, a world would bloom from the ashes before them. Some said, the eldest did not sleep, only sat motionless while their spirit wandered. They knew things no one had spoken aloud. Who was with child? Who had seen death in a dream? Whose heart had grown tired of waiting? These truths came uninvited into the eldest's voice, sometimes mid-sentence, as if truth was smoke curling through story, and no one questioned it. For the truth always came wrapped in warmth, that the eldest carried the flame in more than gesture. A small clay bowl followed them, no matter where they went, its cracked lips smeared with soot, its interior lined with char. It was said this bowl held the breath of the first fire, passed from hand to hand, through generations. No one knew how the flame within stayed warm even when the wind blew cruel, but it did, and when the fire at camp died, it was this bowl that birthed it again. No one dared touch the bowl unless asked. One child did once, years ago, and the bowl remained cold for 7 days. The wind screamed during those nights, and nothing baked in ovens rose. Even mother's milk soured. On the 8th day, the child apologized without being told to, and the eldest whispered into the bowl. That night, the fire roared as if grateful, and bread rose as though remembering joy. The eldest never traveled far. Their feet dragged through the dust with a rhythm that made birds pause and dogs lie down. But despite their slowness, the world seemed to wait for them. Rain would not fall until they had gathered herbs. Lightning never struck trees near their path. Even when death came near, it circled them as if unsure of its right to approach. Once, a stranger asked the eldest their age. The others held their breath. The eldest only smiled, revealing gums like polished bone, and said, "Older than the hill that guards our dead." The stranger laughed, but the wind stirred then, as if to agree. Later, the stranger left quietly, leaving behind a necklace of bone and obsidian. It was never spoken of again, but the eldest wore it from that day on. The tribe often consulted the eldest in matters of life and crops, but not war. War belonged to the young, hot-blooded, and blind. The eldest, it was said, saw too far to care for such noise. Once, when two warriors fought over vengeance, the eldest stepped between them with a single glance. The fire behind them flared, though untouched, and both men fell to their knees, weeping not for defeat, but for the clarity only silence can bring. When sickness came, the eldest did not offer herbs first. They offered stories. They would sit beside the ill and speak of wind that could carry voices through time, or of water that remembered the shape of every hand it touched. Sometimes the stories healed faster than the poultices, other times they did not, but the dying always smiled at the end. Having been seen and spoken to like gods in passing, there was one tale the eldest never told, though many asked. It was of the cave behind the hill, sealed with rock and blessed with silence. Some said the eldest had placed something there long ago, a voice, a heart, a shadow. They never confirmed it, but every full moon they walked there alone, barefoot and humming, with the clay bowl in hand. The fire within never dimmed during those pilgrimages. It was not the eldest's words alone that shaped memory, it was how they sat, how they listened. They could hear a bird's silence and know its grief. They could hear a child's chatter and pluck out the single note of fear hidden within. They were not loud, nor feared, but they bent the world gently around their presence, the way gravity tugs without asking. At times, they wept, though never for themselves. Once, they wept when a woman gave birth to a still child. Another time, when a tree, 3 generations old, split from lightning. They wept for losses that echoed through roots and breath. Their tears fell without sound and dried upon their cheeks, like salt from an ancient sea. No one asked the eldest to bless a union. They simply came and placed one finger on the joined hands. That was enough. No words were needed. The couple would feel it, a warmth that wasn't heat, a trembling that wasn't fear. Some marriages lasted longer because of that touch. Some fell apart later, but all began with that silent fire. Their death was not feared, only wondered about. Would the flame pass on? Would the clay bowl crack? Would the stories scatter like ashes? But the eldest once said, the flame knows its next home. And so no apprentice was named, no chosen successor. Just faith that flame begets flame, and stories find lips when the time is ready. Some believe the eldest was not the first, but simply the most recent, that there was always an eldest before, and always one to come. That memory moves like fire from log to log, never burning twice the same, but always giving light. In that way, the eldest was not one body, but many braided by time and soot and whispered names. Their fire outlasted many storms. When tents collapsed and boats overturned, when rains soaked bone and grief flooded dreams, the eldest's fire remained dry. It was a promise, not of safety, but of return. So long as one breath remembers warmth, they would say, the cold cannot win. And when the eldest finally lay down for the last time, no one wept at first. They sat beside the fire and listened, to crackle, to silence, to wind through hollow reeds. Then, when the flames sighed into stillness, a child reached for the clay bowl, and it was still warm. In the hush before dawn, when the sky was neither dark nor light, but something in between, a breath held by the earth, there existed a stillness more complete than silence. The sand did not shift, the wind did not stir. Even the stars seemed to pause their descent, reluctant to give way to morning. In that moment, the world listened inward. There was no hurry, no command, only the wide exhale of time itself stretching between the stars and the dust. An old woman once said that stillness was the first language. Before the gods carved speech into the tongues of men, before rivers learned to babble and birds to sing, there was only the knowing that came from sitting quietly, open-eyed, under an untroubled sky. It is in that stillness, she whispered, where all truths first bloomed, not in words, but in the space between them. Even the youngest child, fidgeting in their woven blanket, felt it, a pause that wrapped itself around the ankles, slowed the breath, softened the eyelids. Parents never taught it directly. It was learned through watching, through the morning rituals, through the moments when laughter hushed, not from shame, but reverence. The stillness was a teacher older than any elder, quieter than any priest. The potter understood. Hands paused above wet clay, fingers dripping with potential. In those seconds before the next press, the shape whispered its final form. It was not logic that shaped it, but listening. The potter would sometimes close her eyes, not in meditation, but in merging with the wheel, the earth, the waiting lump between her palms, a stillness so deep it made motion possible. Fishermen rising early to mend nets also knew it. Before the tug of fish, before the splash of oar or the shout from shore, there was always a gaze cast across the still waters. The surface, glass smooth and colorless in the half-light, seemed a mirror not of the world, but of the soul. To sit beside it and not speak was not lonely, it was necessary. A communion with something wordless and vast. Children, too, played with stillness like a hidden friend. Beneath the trees whose leaves barely moved, they would lie on their backs, watching clouds unravel. One would speak, then hush, pointing skyward. Listen, they'd whisper, the tree is dreaming. And in that hush, whether it was truth or game didn't matter. They believed, and in belief, the stillness deepened. There were moments during mealtime when even chewing paused, not from shock, but gratitude. A shared glance over a clay bowl, a quiet hum from a mother, the sudden stop of a hand mid-reach. These were not interruptions, but harmonies. Silence was not the absence of sound, but the gathering of presence. Dense and nourishing like steam from broth. Hunters returned with more than meat. They returned with stories, not always spoken aloud, etched instead in the way they sat after. Dusk came slower, more grounded. One would crouch, fletching arrowheads or sharpening bone, and then simply stop, eyes unfocused, heart still full from the forest's long hush. No one asked questions. Stillness has its own language, and it tells its stories without sound. Once, during drought, when even the animals walked with their tongues out and leaves curled inward like dry fists, the villagers sat together under a starless sky. No one complained, they drank sparingly and breathed slowly. An elder leaned against the wall and said, "Even now, the rain remembers us." No one replied, but many closed their eyes. That moment stretched beyond hope or despair. It became a prayer made of waiting. Mothers nursed babies in stillness. It was not the feeding, but the quiet gaze between eyes that taught the first lessons. A blink, a breath, a pause in motion, as tiny fingers curled around larger ones. There was no rush in these meetings, only a rhythm older than song, where nourishment passed, not just through milk, but through silence. A silence both full and soft. As sleep, wives sometimes sat beside fires, not speaking to each other, just kneading dough or spinning thread. These were not cold silences, but shared ones. They had spoken all they needed before. The absence of speech was not a void, but a blanket, comfortable, known. Their thoughts moved in parallel, occasionally touching, like two moths circling the same flame without colliding. Even animals felt the stillness. Dogs curled beside sleeping feet, their tails twitching not in dream, but in sync with the night's breath. Birds stood motionless on branches long after the sun rose. Cats blinked, slowly from walls, sensing something beneath movement, beneath hunger. There was a trust in that stillness, a belief that being was enough. Priests bathed before prayer, not to wash filth, but to enter stillness clean. They submerged their heads beneath water, held breath until sound ceased, until even heartbeat felt distant. Then, rising slow, they felt reborn not from ritual, but from returning to a place inside where stillness lived. Only from that place could true words rise to the gods. During mourning, the most profound moments were not the wails or chants, but when the cries fell quiet, when the widow touched the cold hand one last time and simply sat, when the father stood before a wrapped body and closed his eyes. These were the moments where grief and grace shared a breath. Stillness did not erase pain, it gave it space to echo. Old men sat on steps with nothing to do, and this was not idleness. It was honoring stillness, watching shadows move across stone, feeling the day stretch without demand. Sometimes they would hum without sound, just vibrating their throat in tune with memory, their bodies still but their hearts, drifting slowly through days long past. Children asked questions in the loudest way, and, till they didn't, there would come a day when a child would sit beside an elder, not to talk, but to be quiet together. That was the moment of change. The tribe saw it and nodded. To share stillness was to be welcomed into the deeper circle, where life was not explained, only experienced. When lovers touched, the most sacred part was the pause between embrace and breath, that hush, where skin met skin and all else disappeared. No moan, no rush, just nearness. The stillness where desire transformed into devotion, where two bodies remembered the quiet place they once came from, before language and longing divided them. Storytellers sometimes closed their eyes mid-tell, letting the silence grow so thick that the children leaned forward, barely breathing. The silence was part of the story. It was the mountain the words walked over, the pause where meaning found its weight. One heartbeat, two. Then, when the next word came, it landed like thunder in a still canyon. The market, even at its loudest, had moments. A dropped fruit rolling across stone, a stopped argument as sun pierced the dust in gold, a baby's laugh halting the clamor. These breaks, short as breath, taught those who noticed. Stillness could sneak into even the most crowded spaces, asking only to be seen. And it always was, by someone. Women in labor were surrounded not by frenzy, but a circle of quiet strength. The others knew when to hush, when to step back, not for fear, but respect. Birth was a thunder made in silence. Between contractions, there was a calm so deep it touched the mother's bones, a lull in which the child's spirit whispered, "I am coming," and the world held its breath to receive it. Elders who taught healing spoke less than expected. They would place hands on the sick, close their eyes, and wait. The silence told them more than the pulse. The silence carried the story of the wound. Sometimes it carried the cure. Words would come later, but only after the stillness had done its speaking first. The mountains taught stillness without trying. Just standing in their shadows stilled the pulse. They did not move, yet shaped winds. They did not shout, yet all animals listened. Those who climbed them alone came down changed, not from height, but from the way silence at the summit became part of their breath forever after. There was once a woman who spent her days weaving mats. She spoke little and sang less, but the weave of her patterns held stillness in them. Anyone who sat upon her mats dreamed deeper, slept quieter, and rose with fewer knots in the soul. It wasn't magic, it was care threaded in stillness, given without noise. Death, when it came softly. Most did not fear it. They simply listened. The breath slowed, the fingers loosened. The last look wasn't panicked, but reflective, a mirror gazing into another mirror. And then stillness, so complete, it felt like the beginning of something, not the end. A return to the first hush dot, and always, the fire remained a reminder. Between flickers, between crackles, there was that same Beatles' space, as if the flame remembered the time before it was lit, and in that space, those around it found themselves again not in motion, but in the moment where motion paused, that sacred hush, that eternal breath, that moment of stillness. The sun, once fierce and golden, softened into amber, and then into nothing. Its retreat was not a surrender, but an offering of final glow, brushing the tops of reeds, the lips of the river, the faces of those who stood watching from rooftops. It always ended like this. No clamor, no urgency, just a deepening quiet that folded into the hearts of the people like linen folded into a drawer. Even the youngest child knew the stillness that followed was different from the stillness of dawn. This was not the beginning, but the exhale after all things were said and done. Laughter had long drifted into memory, footsteps faded into sandals hung on pegs, and voices that once argued over lentils or sandcakes were now quiet, mellowed by the dark. The fire dimmed to coals. Women stirred the last embers not to cook, but to draw warmth. It was in those moments, when the light cast long, trembling shadows on the mud-brick walls, that the home seemed to sigh. No broom swept now, no jug clanged. Even the goats had grown silent, curling in tight shapes near the door. Sleep waited patiently. It did not rush out. Children, who moments ago ran with palms full of dust, now lay with heads on their mother's thigh, or on bundles of cloth that once carried grain. No one needed to hush them. Something in the air like a priest's slow hand, or the hush of incense slowed them. Their small limbs twitched in surrender. The silence before sleep was their cradle, ancient and unspoken. A father sat with his back to the wall, his knees drawn up, fingers laced loosely together. His eyes were open but unfocused. His thoughts did not race. He was not remembering or planning. He was only existing, in that stretch of quiet where the heart beats slower, where the breath lengthens. Stillness had filled the room like cool water fills a jar, slow, weightless, essential. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, then vanished into wind. Its note was not lonely, but part of the hush, a lullaby made for no one and everyone. The Reeds bent in the breeze without rustling, and the palm leaves above the courtyard barely trembled. Even the insects changed their song to a lower hum, as if mindful not to disturb the gathering quiet. The woman who sat beside the doorway brushed her fingers over her calf in small, steady motions. She was not itching, not tired. She was remembering, a rhythm older than thought, the comforting sweep of touch, the soft grounding of her own skin. Her eyes were on the floor, where dust had settled in patterns she did not question. Sleep was a tide slowly washing over her dot in the corner. An elder adjusted her shawl and gazed toward the roof. She remembered other nights, many, too many to name. Nights when children giggled too long, when the storm winds beat against the walls, when the jackal cried out from far fields. But this night was calm, and in the hush, she felt herself not old, but timeless. Sleep would take her gently, as it always had. Oil lamps sputtered and dimmed, their flames drawing long ribbons of gold that danced, then died. No one rushed to relight them. Darkness was not feared here, it was understood. It was part of the ritual. When the fire dimmed, the heart knew it was time to turn inward, to retreat from noise and deed. The silence before sleep was the soul's invitation to return. Even the walls, it seemed, held the quiet. Their sun-baked surfaces reflected, no sound, only memory. The laughter of the day still clung faintly in corners, but it did not rise again. It slept too, wrapped in shadow and heat. The ceiling beams creaked only once, then settled. No one spoke, not from command, but from reverence. This was a sacred pause. Dreams began before eyelids fell. A boy saw the river in his minder boat. He had never rowed fish, he had never caught. A girl imagined a golden cat walking silently across stars. Their minds were open fields now, welcoming the stories that came in silence. No voice needed to guide them. The silence before sleep told its own tales, deeper than language. Hands, once busy with grinding stone or sweeping ash, now rested on folded cloth. Fingers that had pressed dough or braided hair lay still, half curled like resting petals. There was no need to unclench them. The stillness had already done so. It worked through breath, through space, through time, a healer with no sound. Across the village, doorways darkened. Lamps were covered, not snuffed. Clay pots were sealed. A final jar was tucked beneath a woven mat. These were not chores, but rituals. Each movement was slower, softer, designed to soothe, to close the day gently. Even a mother's whisper to a child held no instruction, only rhythm, the rhythm of goodbye to wakefulness. Some nights, a lute might hum one note, drawn across a quiet courtyard, then silence. Not a song, but a gesture, a bow, a breath, a release. On such nights, the stars seemed to listen more closely, leaning toward the rooftops to eavesdrop on the quiet reverence of mortals surrendering to sleep. And in return, they shimmered a little brighter. The dog, curled by the door, was still. It did not guard, did not stir. Sleep came for animals too, wrapped in the same hush that blanketed stone and skin. The creatures of the night moved outside, unseen, their paws soft as shadows. No danger stirred. The quiet held even them in respect. Sleep was not hunted, it was shared. A pot of dried herbs swung gently from a hook above the hearth. The fragrant spit, warm still, hung faint in the air. Its purpose was long done, yet its scent reminded those still awake of healing, of safety, of the small blessings kept in jars and bundles. Smell, unlike sound, remained in stillness, floating, comforting, whispering without voice. The youngest girl blinked slowly, her eyes half open. She watched the ceiling disappear into darkness. Her fingers traced nothing on the linen beside her. She listened for stories, but none came aloud. Instead, the hush told her what she needed, that she was safe, that she was loved, that the world had quieted and she was allowed to join it. And so she did. A man who once fought in desert skirmishes now slept without sword or sandal. His head rested on his arm. His breath matched the wind's slow rhythm. In sleep, he was neither warrior nor builder. He was only breath and flesh and dream. And in that moment, before he fell into full slumber, he remembered nothing and needed nothing. The moon, round and high, glanced over the walls but did not enter. It watched. It waited. Its pale light touched the tops of pots, the edges of reeds, the tips of resting fingers. It brought no cold, only light, and the light was gentle. It did not disturb the silence, but joined it another layer of hush. Soft as a mother's exhale, No one said good night. They never had. It was not the way of things. Sleep was not a door closed with sound, but one that drifted open with stillness. Words, even kind ones, would only shatter the delicate bridge forming between waking and dream. They parted with glances, with slow blinks, with silence. Old songs floated like ghosts through memory, not sung, not hummed, but felt. Songs learned, in infancy, held in marrow. The silence before sleep carried them better than voice ever could. And as the people lay back, muscles slack, eyes closed, those silent songs stitched themselves into the fabric of their dreams. On the rooftop, one boy watched stars until they blurred. His sister beside him had already dozed off, a faint smile on her face. He did not move. The wind curled through his hair, soft and low, and as he finally allowed his body to sink against the cool clay, he felt not alone, but held by the sky. The hush, the infinite silence above. The breath of night was long and deep. It moved through every home, every sleeping chest, every dreamer's brow. It did not rush, nor did it stop. It was the hush of centuries, the stillness that had watched over pharaohs and farmers alike. And though no one named it, all trusted it. It never failed to arrive on a world of drums and digging, of cattle cries and festival chants. The silence before sleep was the counterweight. It balanced all things. It reminded even the busiest soul that they were not what they did, but what they became in the quiet moments. And in that becoming, they found peace. Sleep came slowly, then all at once, and the village, once full of life and voice, now breathed as one body, soft, slow, sacred. The silence before sleep had done its work, not by pushing, not by pulling, simply by arriving, like a priest with no sermon, a mother with no command, a god with no need for praise. She did not have a name that many remembered, not one etched on temple stone or buried beneath rows of glyphs, but the river remembered her. It spoke of her in ripples, in silt carried from Nubian hills, in reeds that whispered at dusk. When the moonlight struck a certain bend, her shadow would sometimes flicker across the surface, not as a ghost, but as a memory still being sung by water long before the sun rose. While the village still slept, and goats murmured in their dreams, she had already stepped barefoot into the shallows, her skirts gathered just below her knees, arms folded with practiced ease. She did not fish, nor wash clothes. She simply stood there, eyes closed, listening to the hush between the frogs and the ripples. Her kind of temple. The river was her cradle. It had been since birth. Her mother had labored in a reed hut, not far from the shore, and the first water ever to touch her was drawn from this current. It was said that her first cry had silenced the nearby birds, not from fear, but as if they paused to hear what she was bringing into the world. She carried that silence with her, always. By day, she would walk the banks without direction, stopping to press her palms into mud, lifting strands of weed to her face like a perfumed veil. People said she was strange, but never unkind. Children watched her as one might, a heron curious but distant. She moved slowly, as if she were not truly walking, but flowing. Her steps left no footprints in sand, or if they did, the river swept them away too quickly to matter. She did not speak often, but when she did, her voice was soft, low, and certain. Old women asked her about weather. Men asked her where to cast nets. Her answers were always brief, but usually right. The rain would fall at dusk, the fish would bite near the bend. She never said how she knew. Perhaps she didn't know, but only felt, the way water feels a reed long before it bends. At night, she would lie beneath the open sky, not in a house, but in a blanket of reeds she had woven herself. She slept near the river's edge, her body curled with its curve, as though they were made of the same memory. Dreams came to her differently. They did not rise from within, but floated down the river and entered her mind like boats slipping into a quiet dock. Sometimes she dreamed of women she'd never seen braiding each other's hair, singing to clay pots, pressing red ochre to their cheeks in the hour before festival. Other times it was animals, crocodiles with feathers, ibises that whispered in riddles. She never asked if these things were real. Reality, to her, was just another dream. The sun woke up each morning. One night, the villagers saw her walking with a blue scarf tied around her arms, not her head. She moved slowly, her eyes wide as if seeing a procession no one else could. When asked later, she said nothing, only smiled. But a week later, the floods came early, gentle, generous, life-giving. Her silence had been enough warning. Enough. Blessing. There were times she vanished for days. The first time it happened, they searched. A child cried near the riverbank, thinking the reeds had eaten her. But she returned, walking out of the mist before sunrise, her feet damp, her eyes distant. She carried nothing, yet her presence was different, heavier somehow, as if she'd returned, with an extra part of the sky folded into her chest. The healer once said she had been touched by Sobek, god of the Nile, but the old priest disagreed. Not touched, he whispered, born with river in her veins. She is what happens when the gods dream too close to the water. No one argued. The priest was half blind and mostly mad, but even children knew better than to speak against truth that felt heavier than reason. When the harvest was poor, she was the one people watched, not with blame, but with hope. If she smiled by the river, it meant rain was coming. If she sat still for too long, hands resting too quietly in her lap, the elders gathered and made offerings, not to her, never directly, but to whatever she listened to when her eyes went far and her voice stilled. She was not young, not old. Her face shifted with the light. In early morning, she looked like a girl barely past maidenhood. At dusk, she wore the lines of someone who had seen 1,000 dawns. The children began calling her Aunt River in whispers, afraid to say her real name aloud in case it broke something sacred. Even her laugh sounded like water falling over smooth stone. Once, during a feast, a stranger tried to speak with her, to court her with stories and roasted figs. She listened, smiling politely, then walked to the water and let the wind answer in her place. He did not return the next day. Some say he dreamed of her for the rest of his life and never found rest again. Others say she gave him a glimpse of something too deep for land-bound men to bear. She was not lonely. The river was always with her, whispering, curling around her ankles, offering dragonflies and lilies like companions. When storms came, she stayed. When droughts cracked the mud, she stayed. She didn't worship the river, she was part of it. To leave it would have been like asking a tree to walk away from its roots. Her hands were strong but gentle. When she touched wounded birds or broken reeds, they healed. Not because of magic, but because her touch carried the weight of patience. The patience of current-shaping stone, the kind of time that forgets itself and becomes everything else instead. In her dreams, the river never stopped flowing. Even in sleep, she felt it moving beneath her. Through her, sometimes, the river showed her faces those who had died, those not yet born. She would wake up crying without knowing why. The tears slipping into the soil, returned to the water that had borrowed them. One year, during the flood, she disappeared for 3 full moons. They thought she had drowned. They mourned her quietly, without ceremony. But one dawn, she was there again, combing her hair with fingers damp from mist. No one asked where she'd been. She had returned with a silence deeper than absence. There was a child once who followed her without speaking, mimicking her steps, sitting where she sat, watching the river, as if it too could teach him. She never scolded him. She gave him a shell, pale and cracked, and whispered only once, "Listen." He kept that shell for the rest of his life. When he was old, they said he could hear storms coming by, putting it to his ear. The elders believed she would never die, not truly. That when her body grew tired, it would dissolve into the river, not sink, but blend. That her spirit would become the mist that clings to morning reeds, the sudden sparkle that catches a fisherman's eye, the voice that lives in the hush between water and stone. No burial would be needed, no tomb, no marker. The river would carry her name, whispered in eddies, and wept through flood waters. Children born after her would still dream of a woman walking across the water, never sinking, her hands full of stars and silence. Even the stars, on the clearest nights, seemed to scatter in patterns like her footprints, as if the sky itself tried to map where she'd gone. And the moon, full and unblinking, cast a path of silver over the Nile, just wide enough for one person to walk, barefoot and without fear. She never claimed to be wise. She never spoke in riddles or war charms. Yet when she stood beside the river, time itself seemed to pause, not in awe, but in recognition. The water knew her. The earth knew her. The dreams that passed through her were never hers alone. She held them gently, for all of them, for those who slept, and those still learning how. When she finally left, if she truly did, there was no sound, no farewell. Just a morning where the river shimmered a little longer, the reeds bowed without wind, and the village paused, without knowing why. But the children kept listening, and sometimes, on very quiet nights, they swore they still saw her walking just beneath the surface, dream-wrapped and smiling. When the wind passed over the mouth of the old tomb, it did not howl or rush, it sang, low and steady, as if someone had pressed lips to a hollow flute, long forgotten by hands, long forsaken by name. The villagers called it the breath of the stone, but those who lingered longer near the cliffs knew better. It was not merely air, it was memory, moving. Each grain of sand carried the weight of 1,000 footsteps, no longer visible. Each rock bore marks etched not by chisel, but by the insistence of centuries, and though no one lived beneath those cliffs anymore, their presence, those who once laughed, wept, or waited, clung like scent to old fabric, impossible to wash away. A shepherd boy once wandered too close to the tomb's opening, chasing a goat that had wandered uphill. He swore he heard his mother calling from within the shadows, though she was home with his baby sister. He stood there, trembling, while the wind curled round his ears and whispered words he could not remember the shape of, but which left his heart aching with familiarity. The elders told stories around small fires, stories of a priestess who had guarded that place not with weapons, but with silence. She wore a crown of reeds and never blinked. They said she could hear the future as clearly as the present, because time folded for her like linen, creased but still whole, and always near. Some believed that time did not move forward in those cliffs, that it stood still or even turned backward in slow, looping spirals. Birds flying past would sometimes pause in mid-air, it seemed, their wings caught in invisible threads. The sun lingered longer above the tomb's shadow. Even the insects walked with unusual care, as if tracing forgotten maps beneath their feet. The echo was not always a sound. Sometimes it was a thought, suddenly in your mind as you picked berries or swept a courtyard. Sometimes it was a feeling being watched, not with malice, but with knowing, the kind of knowing that comes only from someone who has already lived through your decisions, your regrets, your joys. That once, a woman mourning her lost husband came to the tomb's mouth and wept. She brought a bundle of linen and an oil lamp, lit though the wind threatened to take it. She didn't speak aloud, but inside she screamed. The next morning her tears were gone, dried not by sun, but by some unseen mercy. In their place, a small pile of shells one's only found days downriver waited by her feet. Children began leaving small offerings near the tomb, dolls made of corn husks, stones painted with ochre. Songs hummed under their breath. They weren't afraid, not the way adults were. They believed the echo would remember them, carry their voices forward into other lives, other suns. They believed they were being listened to by something more patient than God's dot. At dusk, if you walked close enough, the tomb seemed to pulse, not physically, but like a heart far beneath the stone, beating so slowly you only noticed it when you stopped to breathe. People spoke of dreams that started at the tomb and ended in their beds, visions of boats carved from glass, of trees speaking in human tongues, of hands made of smoke braiding their hair. It was not haunted. No shadows leaped, no bones rolled from the dark. Instead, it exhaled. Not every night, but on certain ones, the ones when the sky felt closer and the stars too many to count. The breath it gave smelled of old flowers and ink. Those who inhaled it deeply would not speak for days, their minds sorting through memories not their own. The tomb was never sealed, not by brick, nor by decree. It remained open, patient, unmoving. Even when floods came and tried to drown it, or when sandstorms tried to bury it, it endured, as if time had made a deal with it, to wait together until the last name was spoken and the last light burned out. Scholars came once, with papyrus and measuring rods, muttering in languages that the stones did not answer. They mapped and scraped, measured echoes and humidity, but they left with nothing. Their tools could not hold memory. Their scales could not weigh presence. The tomb had nothing for them. It did not offer its echo to those who came to take it. A blind woman once sat beside the entrance for an entire season. She whispered every day to the air, to no one in particular. When she left, her eyes were still useless, but her hands now moved as if writing things she'd never learned. She was seen drawing symbols in the dirt, symbols that old priests claimed hadn't been spoken aloud in over 1,000 years. It was not a place of power, it was a place of remembering, and remembering is not loud or sharp. It does not demand, it lingers, it suggests, it hums quietly beneath your ribs until your dreams start to shift. and the sound of your own thoughts begins to resemble a song you've never heard but missed terribly. Some nights, lovers climbed the cliffs to lay beside it, not out of bravery, but longing. They said that the echo made them feel as though they had met before and would meet again, that their souls were not meeting for the first time, but returning after centuries apart. The tomb didn't bless them, it merely acknowledged them. That was enough. The goats avoided the area, their ears twitching at things no one could hear. But the wild birds often perched along the tomb's upper ledge, singing songs that did not match the season, songs out of place, belonging to times when gods still walked through wheat fields and gold was worn for its memory, not its worth. A girl once disappeared near the cliffs for 3 days. When she returned, she carried a necklace made of woven bark and stone beads. She said she had met someone who remembered her from another lifetime, a tall woman with silver eyes who lived behind the walls of time. No one believed her, yet the necklace sang in the wind like a bell, and her voice was never the same again. Even the clouds moved differently above the tomb. They curled into spirals, or hovered too long without rain. Birds circled it without reason. Leaves blown near its mouth settled as if resting. Even silence sounded deeper near it, like the quiet of water about to speak. People never built around it. No one dared, not from fear, but from respect. They understood, even without being told, that to build near it would be like building atop your own grave, before your story was done. The tomb was not past. It was waiting, not for resurrection, but for someone to listen well enough. Time, near that tomb, became soft. The hours folded inward, like petals. The days felt dreamlike. A woman once claimed she grew older in one afternoon while seated beside the entrance. Her reflection in the river that evening held a white streak in her hair that had not been there at dawn yet. For all its presence, the tomb never asked to be remembered. It was not lonely. It did not crave song or praise. It existed simply because something had to remain a still point in the whirl of years, a reminder that memory itself had form, weight, and voice, and that sometimes it chose to echo. Even now, when wind moves through that hollow, it carries a strange calmness, not peace, exactly, but understanding, as if someone long ago is still whispering through it. I was here, I am still here. You too will echo.